The protagonist saw the man again in a dream, but he only remained standing without being able to do anything. Upon waking up, she wondered if her abilities had been lost due to not using them for such a long time. At that moment, a young man exclaimed that it was good Charn was awake, because an invitation from the Freyline to the Imperial Palace had arrived. Walking down the hall of the royal castle, she reflected on how long it had been since a slave had set foot there. Approximately 10 years had passed since her homeland, the island of Sursum, was conquered, and 3 years later she and Pachin were captured to be sold as slaves. When all the servants and slaves arrived at the inner palace, the administrator Catherine announced that she had gathered them there especially. She explained that the emperor would return soon, so the palace urgently needed advisors. Servants and maids. The crowd murmured in discontent, as rumors were spreading that serving a mad monarch was equivalent to going mad oneself. Charn observed that it was the first time servants and slaves had gathered together. And Pachin deduced that it meant the war was almost over. Unfortunately, for the castle servants, the emperor was not someone they should respect and revere. That is why they avoided him out of fear. Emperor Julian started the war, and now it is said that servants are killed. And one every day. The monarch was married twice, but both his wives died violently. And it is claimed that the emperor himself caused it. Catherine asked if there were volunteers, and added that proactive slaves and servants would have special benefits. The woman indicated that working in the palace was quite prestigious, so it would be paid with 100 crans. But no one dared to express their desire to serve in the palace, as they understood that 100 crans was an insignificant price compared to death. The administrator said that if there are no volunteers for service in the castle, people will be chosen randomly from the crowd. Pachin murmured that she should have said so from the beginning, she just wasted time talking. And Charn, for some reason, remembered her dreams right now. Mentioning His Majesty made her remember the man who appears every night in her dreams. Pachin asked the sad Charn what was wrong. She, in turn, asked if he knew why those terrible rumors circulated about the emperor. The young woman pointed out that His Majesty spent many years at war, and normally, people like that in society are respected and are called heroes. Pachin supposed that Emperor Julian was considered a mad killer because of the witch's spell. When the young woman asked him to tell her what it was about, he explained that 25 years ago a lady was burned alive at the stake. This story began when an ordinary woman became a brave knight to honorably defend Valdec in a prolonged war. It seemed she had won the trust and respect of the empire, but when the war ended, evil gossip caused His Majesty to act dreadfully. Emperor Julian demanded that the woman who risked her life to save the country pay a high price. Among the empire's inhabitants, the rumor arose that this brave woman was a witch. So they tied her to a post. The voices that once shouted words of thanks for saving her now demanded the fire be lit quickly. And kill this devil's bitch. The people who showed the woman their trust and recognition praise her as a heroine. It turned out they were simply lying. Then the woman understood that she had somehow hindered the empire, which is why they decided to eliminate her unjustly. She became so angry that she addressed His Majesty like garbage crawling pointlessly on this earth. Unjustly condemned, she shouted whether being burned alive would be a fair punishment for her loyalty to the nation. She howled that her only faults were having served this imperium and having sworn knightly fidelity. The woman tied to the stake asked Julian what he had done as ruler. If he had simply fled the imperium and abandoned his people. Then he became agitated and demanded that the fire be intensified immediately and that this sorceress's face be broken. The crowd roared with indignation. How dare an impure sorceress insult their great emperor? The woman cried out that if she was a sorceress, then she cursed this miserable ruler. Julian exclaimed happily that the crowd should pay attention, as she herself had confessed to being a sorceress. Burning in flames with her last strength, she pronounced that from now on the emperor would rot alive until his bones were visible. She added that now there would be no man left in the imperium who would serve him loyally, and his heirs would suffer hunger like slaves. She addressed the crowd, urging them to understand that they blindly believed the nonsense spoken by the ruler, and did not realize they were labor cattle. She said that the words of simple commoners, the stones they throw, the fire they lit, were not worth a cent and would not change anything. The people began to demand that the fire be intensified further and threw more stones at the impure sorceress to silence her forever. The woman said she deeply regretted having believed in the best until the end. She decided she wished to become the wind after death so as not to depend on anyone and live for herself. Fachin concluded that no one now wished to have any connection with the imperial family. Since all the witch's words had come true, the woman decided that from now on she had to be more careful, as those who possess magic are executed in the empire. And all because of that spell. The woman said she was going home to change clothes, so Fachin asked her to take his along too. Charles perfectly understood that it was dangerous to work for the cursed emperor. But on the other hand, they paid 100 cranes a week. She imagined that this way she would save up for her rescue from slavery and pay off her parents' debts. In her mind, she celebrated that she could finally call her life free and not depend on anyone. Suddenly, Charles smelled a strong scent of blood. She didn't even have time to blink when someone placed a cold saber against her throat. At that moment, one of the maids informed Catherine that His Majesty had already arrived and said they preferred to go to the training ground alone. She was indignant because that was impossible, as it had been promised that the emperor would arrive in 3 days. However, a man in blood-soaked armor pointed his weapon at her neck and asked who she was and what she was doing there. The woman's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and she could distinguish the corpse of a horse behind the man with the saber. At that instant, Charles understood that the murderous emperor himself was standing before her. The man insisted she confess what she was doing there, but the woman was deeply frightened by the dark aura emanating from his threat. She murmured that she had arrived by chance. The man smiled and replied that everyone usually says the same thing. Then the slave decided to flee, as she was sure they would kill her without mercy. Upon reaching the orca's claws/talons, assuming she grabbed some weapon item, the woman grabbed them and shouted that if the man took one more step, she would kill him. Charn did not know how close he would get or how to get rid of the pursuer. The young man thought she was a tiny and pitiful being, especially since she was only a servant. Charn called the man crazy and asked him why he had killed the horse, which was an imperial one. He replied that he had given it an honorable death, and the girl hesitated whether the killer considered her foolish. She didn't understand what the man expected. Did he think she would swallow the lie that the animal asked for such a fate? Charney's patience ran out after realizing that the lunatic was only spouting nonsense. She raised her claws to scare him away, but the young man reacted in time and grabbed the end of the claws. With one hand, he lifted her up and said that the horse had eaten poisonous fruits during the fight, and an imperial horse deserved an honorable death. The girl was stunned and did not believe she was in front of an imperial knight, when suddenly she heard Pachin's voice. The boy ran towards the spot. He hugged Charn and recognized the imperial emblem on the wounded man's armor. When Pachin whispered, terrified, that he was an imperial knight, Charn understood that she would die for threatening him with claws. The killer kept approaching, so she decided she did not want to die there, and at that moment, Charn chose to flee. She grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it directly into the attacker's face. They managed to escape, and Pachin asked if they had acted correctly, given that he was an imperial knight. Charn was surprised how Pachin immediately recognized the imperial emblem on the attacker's armor despite the darkness. And the bloodstains. The girl felt embarrassed, as she initially believed he was just a malicious spirit. That is why she attacked him with orca's claws/talons. Charn asked if they could pretend nothing had happened. Pachin speculated that perhaps he wasn't a knight, but the emperor himself, since he was also blonde. The girl indignantly declared that it was completely absurd, since everyone knew that His Highness would only appear in his palace in 3 days. A few moments later, the news arrived that the honor guard had finally arrived. Led by the emperor himself, Charn saw that at the head of the column walked that fair-haired man who had attacked her. And he was covered in horse blood. The young man noticed her in the crowd and gave a sneering smile, while Charny could not believe what was happening. But that same night, she ended up tied in front of the man she had thrown dirt at. The young man called her a mouse and said he had caught her to finally find out who she was and what she was doing there. After some time, the girl, pretending to be a court servant, would push a food cart throughout the entire Imperial Palace. As she walked, she would overhear the servants' conversations, who wondered why Emperor Julian had suddenly decided to return. Some thought His Majesty had sensed danger, because the Chancellor had ruled for many years after his father's death. They claimed that bloody winds would soon blow in the Imperium. Charn decided to ignore the rumors, as she didn't care about them. Entering the stable, Charn called Pachin and told him she had brought food for him, since he had helped the court servants today. But the room was empty and Pachin's bed was made, which surprised her because the work had been finished a long time ago. An angry male voice asked who she was and who had hired her. And Charn did not understand what they were talking about. He said that Chancellor Albert had sent her to spy on him, but the girl denied everything. She asked the ruler rhetorically how a high-ranking man could associate with a slave. The king ignored him and sarcastically asked if that was why the slave had tried to hit them and flee from combat. The young man commented that it was obvious Albert had many eyes and ears in the palace, including among the slaves. She shouted that she didn't know the man was the emperor then, much less that he had killed his horse so easily. The young man asked for clarification. Did she consider him a murderer? Charn stammered that she was just a slave, and the emperor shouldn't pay attention to her words. She added that she had shown disrespect by misunderstanding him, whereas the emperor had given his horse an honorable death. The young man commented that she wasn't the only one Albert had bought. It was typical of the Chancellor, who always seeks profit. The emperor explained that his warhorse was well-trained and had served for many years. But upon arriving at the palace, it ate poisoned berries. The young ruler concluded that it was a strange coincidence, obvious that the prime minister was trying to kill him. The emperor said the slave was lying elegantly, but wondered if her words would match those of the man who worked with her that night. He gave an order to his aide. Then they brought Pachin, along with the tied Charn and the emperor. The young man barely had time to scream Charn's name before he was taken to a room. The girl was horrified to hear a lion roar, and the emperor said that everything depended on the young man whether he would live, or whether he would also be dinner for the lions. Charn was confused. Did Emperor Julian think she was a man? The girl supposed that the emperor thought so because of the smell of manure and masculine clothing. At that moment, the lion came out of the cage and headed straight for Pachin. Luckily, there was a rake nearby, and the boy grabbed it as a weapon. The girl begged the emperor to release the poor boy, as he was not at fault, and to punish her instead. His Highness said with a smile that no one was holding the deer back. He was free, but he had to prove he was not guilty. The lion kept approaching, jumping and roaring furiously. Pachin dodged the animal with the rake, but it was clear his chances of survival were nil. The girl couldn't stand it anymore, and to try to stop the unequal fight, she shouted with all her might that she would prove her innocence. His Highness reacted instantly and gave the order to stop. The lion immediately calmed down, and Pachin finally managed to catch his breath. His Highness asked Charn to begin. She said that she and her brother were simple servants. The young woman added that for 3 years they had only been feeding the horses and collecting their manure. Leaving the place was forbidden. She specified that neither she nor her compatriot had ever seen the emperor, and asked who among them could be a spy to suggest. Suddenly, Charny fell silent and realized that these words were not enough to prove it. She had to invent a precise answer, or her compatriot would die because of her. The girl prayed mentally to find something convincing to tell the emperor. Suddenly, she remembered the man from her dreams. The young woman realized that the man in her dreams was the emperor, and that the feeling of fear after the dream was a premonition of today's incident. She remembered that in the dreams, the man was terrified, trembling with fear like a child. and clutched his sword against him. The young woman asked the emperor if he could release his sword at night. She said she could help him sleep peacefully. The young ruler snorted discontentedly and dismissed it as nonsense, as he was not afraid of the arrival of the night at all. Sharn reported that she knew a method that would make His Majesty eagerly await the coming of darkness. She promised she could ignite the emperor's blood and delight him. His aide's eyes widened in surprise that a boy was speaking. A few hours later, a half-asleep Julian was already sitting on the bed, rubbing his sword. Hearing footsteps approaching, he said the boy had finally arrived. But looking up, he discovered a beautiful woman in front of him. She bowed and greeted His Majesty, saying she had come as promised during the interrogation. Julian remembered how he had spoken with his aide and tried to understand how the interrogated young man knew about his nightly problems. He recognized that he had told no one about it, and Colin had reported that there were no signs of contact between slaves and the opposition. The aide concluded that there was no further information from the spies, but he had to admit that it seemed to him that the slaves were not siblings. Colin added that at first he had believed the interrogated person was an impertinent boy. But it turned out to be a woman. The emperor replied that it was a lie. Someone must have invented the rumor to damage his honor, but Colin insisted that it was not so. But His Majesty ignored the aide's objections, assured that they had no problem seeing, and ordered him to leave. The red-haired man thought it would be interesting to find out what method the captured slave would use, who turned out to be a woman, to cure His Majesty. When the emperor saw the woman in front of him, the first thing he asked was who she was, and what she was doing there. She introduced herself as the slave Sharn and explained that she had come to help the emperor overcome the darkness. His Majesty asked the young woman to clarify what it was about, and she explained that certain natives of Sursum, including herself, possessed a special gift. She said she could see magic and control it. That is why in her dreams she had seen the emperor wandering in the darkness, unable to escape. Sharn declared frightenedly that she was not a sorceress, and the emperor replied that now he didn't care who it was. The only important thing was that it worked. Julian asked her to induce him to sleep and promised that if everything went well, she and her brother would survive. When the slave learned of the opportunity to save Pachen's life and her own, she started acting quickly. She decided to use the first thing at hand, and the emperor pointed out that she was reaching her hands into his bedroom with too much brazenness. Sharn apologized for the audacity and explained that she thought there might be something suspicious on the nightstand. The young woman found a figurine with its limbs tied with rope and clarified that someone had used magic to try to kill His Majesty. She added that the death would have been slow and painful, something Julian could not believe, since Albert had even reached his room. Sharns replied that she would take care of the figurine, and the emperor asked if it was possible to burn it directly. The young woman explained to the lord that black magic is inverted when someone discovers it. She clarified that if a spell was pronounced at the same time, the effect would only fall on the target. But now, the target of the spell had changed. Sharns held the figurine over a lit candle and concluded that now it would be the sorcerer who would suffer multiple burns. Julian was impressed to see how, as soon as she entered the room, the young woman had already identified the cause of his troubles. Sharn murmured satisfiedly that they had already solved one problem. But it was already very late, and His Majesty needed to sleep. As he fell asleep in bed, Emperor Julian held his sword close. A sign of distrust, Sharn asked if His Majesty had ever played word forming, and if perhaps it was another method for sleeping. The maid amusingly suggested they try. Julian thought it was illogical to risk his life for a joke. Sharn announced that she would start and mentioned the first word. But the emperor did not respond. The young woman asked if she would have to play alone. Then, Julian muttered irritably a word, starting with the last letter of the first. They played for a long time, and Sharn worried that all the emperor's words sounded too cruel and bloody. However, His Majesty seemed to approve and finally began to smile moderately. Little by little, the emperor quieted down and did not respond to the word proposed by the maid. Sharn said he could take his time and think. When His Majesty fell asleep, Sharn brought her glowing hand close to his face to cast a spell. The young woman was sure that after that, the Emperor would sleep well and have peaceful dreams. Sharn moved away from the sleeping Emperor's bed and concluded that she was glad everything had worked out. And gone well. The young woman decided she could breathe a sigh of relief, as now she and Pachana definitely would not be thrown to the lion. And the boy would be released from prison tomorrow. Waking up in the morning, Julian could not believe his luck to have finally managed to sleep. He looked at the sleeping maid and remembered that, through the dream, he heard a female voice reciting something like nighttime prayers. His Majesty was surprised not to have even had nightmares and decided to approach the maid. Hearing his steps approach, the young woman woke up. The Emperor cheerfully said he had thought of a word that should be said during the game. Sharon was paralyzed with surprise, and His Majesty announced that for her excellent performance, she would be granted a reward. Her eyes shone with joy, and she mentally concluded that in human life, there is nothing more important than sleep. The young woman began to debate between what to ask for as a reward, her favorite food, or liberation from slavery. But the Emperor had his own version of the reward. He informed the slave that from that moment on she would work in his nightly service as a personal maid. At first, Charn was very happy with the new job, but then reflected that she was receiving more trust than she expected. She used this opportunity to evade a penalty, but the conditions of the new post were clearly better, especially in her situation. Julian asked irritably if the slave dared to consider the imperial proposal, and delay in responding. Sharn assured him that she would feel immense honor in receiving such an appointment, and remembered that she was a humble pagan slave. She asked if someone like her could constantly be close to His Majesty. Julian wanted to know what was wrong with taking a common slave as a maid. The young woman replied that the Chancellor would not allow it and would not stand idly by. Julian became furious and asked if the slave dared to ask the Emperor for the Chancellor's permission. She knew it was a rude and disrespectful attitude, but if the Chancellor found out that someone like her was living and working alongside the Emperor, he would immediately expel her from the palace. She explained that since the Chancellor is currently ruling, the Emperor practically has no power, and that she needed a guarantee of his protection. Julian agreed and asked for the answer. Charon smiled because she feared the Emperor would start arguing and reject the idea. The young woman said that, as the Emperor's personal servant, she would have to stop not only sorcerers, but also carry out secret investigations. She remembered that she was a slave, and as is known, slaves have many limitations. His Majesty asked if she was implying that she wished to be freed. Sharon understood that it was very cheeky, but it was the first time in her life that an opportunity arose where the Emperor urgently needed her. The girl was not going to let the opportunity to end her life as a slave slip away, and affirmed that someone like her was not worthy of being near His Majesty. Emperor Julian smiled condescendingly, and the young woman immediately felt offended. Was he mocking her? Then Julian approached the girl and said that even if he were the shining sun, and she a faceless slave, she could still fit with him. At that instant, Charon wondered if it was really a normal conversation. But why did she then feel the Emperor's dark aura? Collins ran to his lord's study and asked how he had slept the previous night. The Emperor joked that his aide always ran to him like a puppy. That is why his visit did not surprise him. The red-haired boy didn't even get agitated and replied that dogs have an innate sense to smell strange things. He asked them to consider their long friendship and tell what happened the night before and how the slave managed to put him to sleep. Julian said he hadn't slept so well in a long time. Collins noted that his lord had clearly regained energy and asked for more details. The Emperor asked how the aide had discovered that the slave was a woman, and the red-haired boy replied that it had been accidental. He explained that he thought the interrogated slave was hiding something, so he checked the bathtub and identified a feminine outline. His Majesty clarified if the aide meant he saw his servant with her head uncovered. The young man replied that the important parts were covered by the maids. Then he wanted to know why the Lord called the maid his own. The emperor did not answer and ordered Colin to stop talking. He ordered to proceed to the training grounds, inspect the condition and quality of the weapons, and armor, supervise the training of the warhorses. The emperor smiled and added that he was also in charge of inspecting the naked bodies of the soldiers. Colin exclaimed that it was repulsive. Julian added that the soldiers' bodies must be examined starting from the head. Check for wounds, bruises, rot under the fingers, or hemorrhoids. The Lord said it was the duty of a senior officer to worry about his subordinates. Colin asked if he had committed any offense. His Majesty protested and explained that they simply wanted the aide to be an attentive chief. And careful. At that moment, the red-haired man remembered how the emperor got angry upon learning that his servant had been seen naked. He finally understood why those orders suddenly. He remembered that his lord has a difficult character, and decided to ask for forgiveness. Meanwhile, the maids finished helping Charn change and began murmuring among themselves. Admiring the result, Catherine commented that it looked quite good, although a bit masculine. A maid whispered to her friend that the young woman now dressed resembled a foreign noblewoman. Catherine said it was time to go to Emperor Julian, as he could not be kept waiting. On the way, she commented to Charn that only one person in the world could accurately determine her essence. She clarified that if the emperor says a stone is a pearl, the next day it will become one. Just like the servant right now. The woman warned Charn to feel infinite gratitude and not even dare to look away from His Majesty. Catherine knocked on the entrance to His Majesty's chambers and announced that she had brought a new maid. When Charn entered the emperor's room, he became angry about how the clothes from the southern island looked. With a displeased face, the emperor ordered her to come closer and pointed to the document he held in his hands. The young man said that the paper was the chains of his future servant and brought the contract close to the lit candle. The girl was surprised to see that the emperor had personally burned the document that accredited her status as a slave. He affirmed that from that moment on, Charny would no longer be a humble slave and would have the right to remain by his side every day. Tears of joy sprang to her eyes. She was infinitely grateful to the Lord. Now she could return to her homeland and work. But Charny's happiness was cut short when His Majesty handed her another contract. It stated that the service would end when the incurable illness was cured. And a new empress was found. The girl became indignant. That was madness. No one knew if it would ever happen. That agreement was no better than slavery. The emperor calmly said to put a seal at the bottom of the document. Charny replied that she did not have one. His Majesty took the sword and with a smile affirmed that his blood would be enough. He grabbed her hand and started pulling her towards him. But Charny resisted with all her might. The struggle ended when she twisted her ankle and accidentally fell onto the emperor's chest. When Sharon realized, she was lying on His Majesty's chest. She immediately moved away, as if she had been splashed with boiling water. She began to beg the Lord for forgiveness, but he simply looked at her confusedly and turned away abruptly. Sharon was surprised by such a reaction, as it was known that the emperor had been married twice. But both wives died young. The young woman observed His Majesty and thought that now he didn't look like a demon on a warhorse, cutting everything in his path. She said that if His Majesty needed a seal, she could draw something on the bottom of the document. Julian replied that it was not necessary and asked her to sit beside him. Sharon started chatting, saying she had heard that the administrator would pay 100 crans per week to those who worked in the Imperial Palace. The young man calmly mentioned that he would pay her 1,000 crans monthly as a personal maid. Because of her exclamation, the emperor clarified if the amount was too small, and Sharon asked where she should place the seal. The emperor assured that the seal was not necessary, a blood oath was enough. And he explained that in the East, it was like drinking wine mixed with the blood of one and another. This demonstrates the unwavering loyalty of the subjects to their lord, and he, in turn, commits to trusting his men and protecting them. Sharon asked if His Majesty was really sure he wanted to celebrate a blood oath with her. and pay her a considerable amount of 1,000 crans a month. The emperor affirmed that, even though the young woman was a slave, she possessed magical power that demanded recognizing her worth and paying her a fair price. Sharon realized that before she had believed that His Majesty treated her well for hidden reasons. But in reality, he valued her for her merit. She decided that His Majesty's presence in her dreams was a divine message. At that moment, Julian intentionally cut himself with the sword and used his bloody finger to sign the contract. Then he showed the young woman another paper, convincing her that it was necessary to guarantee she would fulfill her job. Sharon was horrified to realize that the emperor was holding Pachen's slavery certificate. Julian clarified that if the servant avoided her duties or decided to betray him, he would kill her friend. A month later, Sharon was mentally counting her achievements. She had learned protocols, watched over the emperor's sleep. She wondered why she was still not allowed to visit Pachen, even though he was under her care. The last time Sharon tried to meet her brother, the butler reprimanded her. She said that His Highness's personal servant could not leave the palace without special authorization. But Sharon longed so much to see Pachen that she decided to ask the Lord directly. In their first meeting, the emperor seemed like an ordinary man to her, not the indifferent demon she had imagined. Approaching His Highness's chambers, she heard a noise and entered without permission. She saw the disorder in the room and, seeing the emperor on the floor with his head in his hands, Sharon guessed that a spell had been cast on him. The emperor writhed in pain, so Sharon rushed to help him, but his hand threw her aside, while the rest of his figure seemed to sink into darkness. The young woman called out to His Highness to regain his senses and reminded him of his name. But it was useless. He grabbed her by the neck. She realized it was useless to ask the emperor to regain his sanity, as he had already completely lost his mind. A thought crossed Sharon's mind. Could the rumor about the bloodthirsty emperor be true? Meanwhile, he threw her to the floor. The girl deduced that everything was the fault of the black ring. She decided to try to remove it, but the emperor was much stronger. He continued to strangle her. Then she thought that if it continued like this, she would lose consciousness. With all her strength, she brought her hands to her torturer's face. Suddenly, a magical light emerged from her palms. That worked. Emperor Julian finally regained clarity and saw Sharon collapsed on the floor with bruises on her neck. He ran his hand over the injured skin and said that apparently he had lost his mind again and almost killed his servant. Mentally, she noted that the emperor seemed vulnerable again, and he apologized for his behavior. Charny discovered marks on her body from having been burned alive. Then she noticed a sharp pain in her chest. It seemed to her that her lungs were torn by anger, deep rejection, and the feeling of having been betrayed. She couldn't figure out whose emotions these were, or who appeared sad every night in her dreams. Suddenly, Charn opened her eyes, saw the emperor's worried face, and understood that he had seen her dream. She wondered if His Majesty suffered so much every night, and if the person who placed that doll could have cast the spell. The emperor said that security measures would have to be reinforced. Charn apologized for having neglected surveillance after getting rid of that doll. His Majesty replied that if everything were so simple, Chancellor Albert would not have left this palace. He recalled how Prime Minister Albert had asked him to be obedient and take his medicine. As he had lost control again, Charn touched her neck and asked the emperor if this was unusual, since the former empress had died this way. The young man asked ironically if the servant was afraid. She nodded her head and affirmed that she needed to know the truth. The emperor sighed annoyedly and said he was tired of repeating that he did not kill his wife, whom he had barely encountered at the wedding. A month later, for some reason, everyone began to say that the bloodthirsty emperor had brutally killed his wife and her maid. Charn wondered if someone powerful, like Chancellor Albert, was trying to strip the emperor of his power. The young man asked why the girl had not fled during the attack. She replied that she was His Majesty's servant and shaman. She remembered that she had sworn loyalty and blood. Moreover, as a servant, she had to trust and protect her lord. The emperor was very surprised by these words as he did not expect to hear that from a servant who had served him for a month. At that moment, the young woman thought that things could not continue like this. She concluded that finding and destroying the cursed doll had been useless, as the culprit still had not appeared. They were probably manipulating the emperor's consciousness, and they had probably eliminated his entourage in the same way. Sharn asked the emperor to wait a few minutes, and meanwhile, she reflected on how to fix everything after this incident. The young woman knew that the emperor was now like a living weapon, but she did not have the strength to break the spell. Besides, it was very dangerous to expose someone to magic. Finally, she managed to find the correct door. She decided that the side room for servants would serve her. The girl announced that from today on, she would be with her lord every night and protect his sleep. She specified that she could stay in the side room, but the emperor affirmed that it was not necessary. Since everything was over, the young man asked her to put him to sleep and leave, but Sharner refused the idea, saying it was a temporary measure that would not protect him. She explained that since the incident happened due to magic, they must respond with the same. His Majesty was surprised that the servant still worried about his protection after he had strangled her. Charn replied that she would endure everything. Exactly like today, and Julian protested, saying the servant was only acting bravely. He asked if she would run to protect him if she had a sword, and Charn shouted that she would do the same without hesitation. Emperor Julian asked a rhetorical question about why the servant spoke to him with such a voice. When everyone calmed down, Charny, in a calm voice, declared that she knew an effective method. She solemnly announced to the emperor that they would unite and become one in spirit, mind, and body. His Majesty understood nothing, and confusion was reflected in his eyes. So he decided to ask what it was for. Charny babbled that the union would help determine what kind of magic it was and what its source was. And the emperor asked her not to attack him like that. The girl stammered, saying she didn't want to say something vulgar. It wasn't about when a man and a woman do something indecent. He told her she didn't have to be ashamed to explain herself, and Charny affirmed that the emperor had clearly misunderstood. She asked how a simple girl like her could have such thoughts about the emperor, if she wasn't even a man. The emperor's face darkened. He asked what she meant. Sharon replied that she had spoken of a peculiar magical protection. His Majesty commented that he was not asking about that. Then the young woman deduced that he referred to her thoughts. She said that, in reality, she had suggested a quite good idea. But Julian's face twisted into a grimace of annoyance. He made a grimace of irritation and reminded the maid how she had assured that the emperor was not a man. Sharon asked if that mattered now, while thinking carefully not to say something that would cost her to fix later. The girl clarified that she meant His Majesty was not a man, because they were the son of the great empire of Valdel. She began to bombard the monarch with compliments, but he only snorted in discontent, saying that the servant had a long tongue. He added that it sounded strange, as if she enjoyed settling in the heart of any commoner. But not the emperor's. The girl replied that she had no plans to settle anyone in her heart, as she already had Pachem. Emperor Julian exclaimed happily that it was excellent news. Sharon looked at him surprised. She announced that now she would explain the protection magic, with which their bodies and minds would become a single unit. She said that the Lord should drip his blood onto a silk thread that had never been used before. Before going to bed, the emperor would tie that thread to his ankle. Sharon explained that she would do the same, but with her own leg. She affirmed that the effect would not be immediate, but if done constantly, eventually it would work. The girl specified that for this, they should remain in the same place, since the side room for servants in these chambers is empty anyway. For some reason, Julian did not like the servant's idea. He asked if she correctly understood that she wanted to change the target of the curse. The young woman confirmed happily, because if the object was taken, it could be dispelled and healed. The emperor protested. He said that perhaps he didn't understand much about magic, but he believed it would be dangerous for the servant. At that moment, Sharn remembered that, depending on the type and intensity of the magic, the body could be destroyed. But His Majesty's curse did not pose a danger to life. It rather seemed like a manipulation. Besides, His Majesty did not yet have an heir. It would be counterproductive to kill a direct descendant of the imperial family. Sharon asked the emperor to clench his fist, and then asked if he saw that controlling him like this was much safer. She affirmed that, first, if she was in danger, Emperor Julian would protect her, as he had done today. His Majesty commented that the tongue of his personal servant was really sharp. Then he urged them to consider that they would not be loyal to Sharon until they saw her usefulness. The girl assured the Lord that he didn't need to worry, and suddenly noticed that the atmosphere was suitable for a plea. She asked if she could leave the palace for a moment, as she had constantly studied the formalities, and helped the emperor sleep for a month. His Majesty gave permission, but warned the maid not to tell anyone that she had previously been a slave in the stables. The young woman thought her colleagues would find out anyway, but she did not say it out loud. She accepted and promised the Lord that she would return soon. The housekeeper, Catherine, saw how the emperor's maid ran somewhere. With her heels clicking, she decided to go to His Majesty's chambers to inform him that a banquet organized by Chancellor Albert would be held tomorrow night. She added that all the aristocrats of the secret council would attend the banquet, and that Princess Stuart would be presented there. The emperor pointed out that she had adopted Albert's surname and asked if the prime minister didn't have any more single daughters. Catherine wondered if, indeed, even without having children, he could have created them and used them for his interests. She informed him that Princess Stuart joined the Duke 3 years ago and received an education worthy of an empress. Julian laughed and remembered that 3 years ago the second empress passed away. He asked if they were already looking for a third wife for him. Catherine replied that it would be strange to yield the place of empress to just any other family. His Majesty pointed out that there was no other alternative, since 2 other prestigious families had offered their daughters previously. Emperor Julian affirmed that now the prime minister could easily seat his daughter in that place, because nobody wanted it. The young man added that if everything continued this way, he would end up in isolation. The administrator recalled that she could not contradict the will of the prime minister. She replied that she was not rejecting the idea and asked Catherine to prepare Sharon for tomorrow's banquet. The young man affirmed that he had to react with the appropriate appearance and eagerly awaited Albert's speech at the banquet. He inquired if Catherine had taken care of Sharon's circle, to which she replied yes. All the serfs and servants who knew her before are now outside the palace. And in the last 3 years, she hasn't even been within the castle walls. She said few people know the young woman, but that probably wouldn't be enough. The chancellor had surely already suspected it. The emperor, with a satisfied expression, declared that that would be enough. Then Catherine, as if in passing, asked where she had sent Sharon. The woman pointed out that it was already time for the emperor to sleep. He replied that the maid had briefly excused herself to leave the palace. Catherine sighed discontentedly, murmuring that the maid had finally gone to meet that man. His Majesty asked again if it was true that Sharon had gone towards him. Catherine affirmed that she had warned her several times to be careful. The woman concluded that Sharon paid no heed to advice and went to meet a young man who had died. At that moment, the girl violently opened the doors and shouted happily that she had finally reached Pachon. However, there was no one in the bedroom. She deduced that it was strange, as her friend should definitely be there at that time. The girl mentally noted that she also hadn't found any of her former colleagues along the way. Suddenly, an unknown boy asked her who she was and what she was doing there. Sharon turned and saw an ordinary employee, but definitely not a serf. She asked where everyone else was. The boy said that everyone who worked there had been sent to a labor camp. Nobody knew how serious their offense was to send them to the mine. He clarified that in the mine they worked until death, receiving beatings every day. Sharon did not understand why Pachon had been sent there, until she suddenly remembered that all pagan serfs belonged to His Majesty. She wondered if the emperor had acted this way against her brother. Instantly, the memory of how the Lord had threatened to kill the serf crossed her mind. The girl trembled with horror, as she had diligently fulfilled her duties, and had never handed him over to the emperor. She decided it was a misunderstanding, as His Majesty would not act like that without warning her first. The girl concluded that the emperor is a man of his word. Today he even worried about her. Leaving the empty bedroom, Sharon decided that as the emperor's personal servant, she must infinitely trust her lord. In her mind flowed a memory of how the lord, at the first encounter, thought she was a boy, and asked her why she was spying like a rat. Then she remembered how the emperor ordered a lion to be set upon her countrymen, and then announced that Pachon's life depended on the interrogated person's words. The girl questioned what her faith was based on, as at first she was infinitely happy. She finally enjoyed the freedom from slavery and a monthly salary of 1,000 coins. The girl fell to the ground in tears. She scolded herself for not having worried about Pachon's safety in the first place, but enjoying her new situation carefree. Sharon and Pachon had been inseparable since childhood. That is why it seemed it would always be that way. It wasn't easy to imagine that something would happen to the boy. The girl blamed herself for what happened. Mentally, she begged Pachon for forgiveness and tried to figure out what to do now. Suddenly, a masculine voice called Sharon from behind her. She turned around and saw Emperor Julian. He looked at her sternly and ordered her to get up from the floor, as it was inappropriate. The girl looked at the emperor and asked if all that was false, that she didn't kill him. But the answer was unexpected. His Majesty accused her not only of greed, but also of being quite bold, and ordered her to follow him. He took her to the main training ground and informed her that it was near the main palace. Sharon said she knew the place because she had cleaned there once, and the emperor asked her to look down. The girl saw her compatriot, alive and well. His Majesty clarified that they were his gladiators. Julian added that it didn't matter who they were, because with a single order, they were ready to get rid of anyone in any way. Charny asked if her compatriot would be educated the same way. The Empire nodded. Then the girl looked at the boy again with concern, but there was no reason to worry, since Pachon didn't feel offended and spoke equally with other gladiators in training. The girl understood that the work camp was just a trap. In reality, he had prepared this place for Pachon. Charn was deeply moved by the Lord's noble action and thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Suddenly, he ran his hand behind her ear, making Charn feel uncomfortable, noticing how her whole body was covered in goosebumps. The emperor recalled having given the slave a chance due to her desperate situation, since she wanted to endure in that damned palace. Later, Catherine spoke with His Majesty and promised to watch the slave at night to confirm if she would really help him. All that was insecure, but it worked. One day, the administrator expressed concern that the emperor spent every night with the maid. Emperor Julian laughed and asked if Catherine perhaps thought that his lord would fall so easily for beauty. She replied that it wasn't so, she just didn't want anyone to break his heart. She remembered how Charny shouted that she was His Majesty's maid and swore by Kiwi. That is why she trusted that he would protect her. She also remembered the moment when the servant, crying, demonstrated that the Lord did not always have to win. She did not forget the servant's favorite phrase, when she shouted at him that sleeping at dusk was not allowed. However, Catherine's words soon arrived about how the boy maintained a close relationship with Sharn Long before coming to the palace. Julian had decided that a long time ago. Words like sympathy and love lack power. They are just illusions. He knew it was absurd to obsess over someone who gave their heart to another, even if the rest belongs to you. His Majesty said there was no need to thank him, as it was just an opportunity to control his serf. Sharn felt that the Lord was annoyed, so she added that he should not thank what was rightfully his. The young man clarified that it also worked in reverse, so the servant should know her place. He reminded her not to forget her priorities, nor that everything she desired would belong to him. When Emperor Julian retired, the girl wondered if it meant she should pay more attention to the contract. Missing her brother, she neglected her duties before the emperor. But didn't he understand her feelings? Sharon concluded that a simple servant could not understand people of noble blood. Now she understood the words of the head maid, who insisted that serving the emperor was with actions. In thoughts, Charn decided that if she wanted to remain in the Imperial Palace, she should not show her emotions so openly. She was absorbed in thoughts about what to do and noticed that the heat in practice was unbearable and suffocating. At that moment, Pachan approached her, calling her by name, and she ran to hug him while happily exclaiming to see him. He replied that at first he thought the goddess Sarcoma had descended to his side. But it turned out to be Sharon. Sharon asked him to look better, as he seemed to have grown and broadened his shoulders. Pachan blushed with embarrassment. The girl looked at him and concluded that the gladiator's life suited him well, as he hadn't smiled like that for a long time. The boy asked where she had been all this time, as he had been very worried. Sharon solemnly announced that she was the emperor's personal servant. She treated his insomnia and fled from black magic. She said that for this, she received 1,000 monthly crowns, which made the boy's eyes open in surprise. She clarified that she would leave this job when the illness ended and the emperor found a wife. She asked Pachan to hold on until then. He smiled and assured her that he liked life this way. He recounted that His Majesty's lion was very well trained and fled completely when the owner appeared. Pachan confessed that at first he greatly doubted the job, but then he deeply thanked the emperor. He swore that now he would give his best to deserve His Majesty's trust and become a great gladiator. The girl admired her brother and thought how passionate his character was, even if he rarely showed it, and pretended that everything was fine. Sharon was so happy that everything was finally settled with her brother, as they had lived in misery for 3 years. And now they had hope. She was interested if Pachan was not uneasy, since she spent every day next to the emperor. Pachan replied that he trusted her more than himself, but feared that, driven by emotions, she would cause pain to someone using magic. Upon hearing that, Sharon melted and affirmed that no man in the world was capable of believing in her and loving her with such intensity. Pachan asked her if she remembered her promise to marry when they returned to the island. But now they both work for His Majesty. She said it was so she could ask the emperor to grant Pachan marriage to her. Then he firmly affirmed that he would always be on Sharon's side, and she replied that she would always support him too. At night, the girl walked towards the emperor's rooms and thought that, although his words sounded cold, they were true. Sharon understood that, before being useful, she hadn't presented herself in the best way. But first, she had to understand that she was no longer a slave. She decided to engrave in her mind that, from now on, she would be a loyal servant and would only worry about the Lord's safety. She entered His Majesty's rooms and announced that she had brought a remedy for insomnia. Julian looked suspiciously at the contents of the cup and asked if it was really the remedy, since it looked like excrement mixed with water. Sharon enjoyed the scene and thought that the emperor was partially right. The concoction really looked repulsive. Mentally, she reproached him for the threats, the oppressive atmosphere, for hiding Pachan from her, and for touching her hair. With irony, she said that the unpleasant taste was due to the many medicinal herbs in the mixture. She asked if the brew was bitter. The emperor took the last sip with effort and replied that everything was fine. Sharon replied that she was glad, since it is said that the more unpleasant the taste of a remedy, the more useful it is. She admitted to adding more bitter herbs. Mentally, the emperor branded her as tricky and brazen. With a satisfied air, he showed the ball of thread lent by Catherine and announced that today he would start with defensive magic. Sharon tied one end of the thread to the emperor's stump and wrapped the other around her ankle. Then she asked the Lord to stay still, as she would now start using magic. When the girl started whispering about the thread, Julian, for some reason, wanted to stretch out his arm and grab her. But a second later, his hand fell. The young man calmed down, smiled meekly, and fell asleep. At that moment, the Prime Minister, Albert Stuart, thought that he had been waiting impatiently for one thing for a long time: the banquet the next day. He asked if the girl had received the dress. She replied affirmatively, and the man said she must eclipse everyone that night. Albert recalled how during the war, Julian fled the battlefield and returned with an army behind him. He was interested to know if anything had changed since then, if the emperor would continue crawling like a deer at his feet, or if he would become a hermit. The man said that this time they could definitely get rid of him if the girl was not mistaken. She obediently accepted with her father and bowed to him. The next day, His Majesty dressed in festive attire in honor of the banquet. Colin pointed out that the Lord looked marvelous and ordered his subordinate not to look at him like that again, since it was repulsive. The red-haired boy remembered that since childhood he had watched him with an admiring look, tender and full of love. Julian said that was ridiculous, and the aide noticed that he had changed since the new maid appeared by his side. The boy observed that shortly before, the Lord resembled a devil hunting heads, but now he seems more lively. The boy deduced that this is how close relationships with a woman act, as her name is blameless when she is with the opposite sex. Julian sighed discontentedly, as his subordinate simply did not understand the essence of his relationship with Sharn. And at night, they did something completely different from what Collins imagined. The Emperor thought that if he revealed the truth now, his aide would laugh at him for years. And he did not wish to kill him. Julian expressed hope that his aide would follow orders as well as he spoke, especially when inspecting the naked bodies of the soldiers. Collins commented that he had heard that Lady Stuart would attend the dinner and hoped she would resemble her father. Julian replied that indeed there was very little information about it, and he was intrigued what strategy Albert's side's spies had used. The boy pretended not to have heard and wondered if the secret plan he received earlier related to the princess. Collins told the Lord that Albert was trying to hide the low status of his illegitimate daughter. The Emperor retorted that rumors couldn't be avoided, no matter how much you tried to hide it. It seemed he had adopted the girl simply to take advantage of her. Collins asked if the Emperor really planned to marry the princess, as she could give him a son. He replied that then Albert would place the grandson on the throne and snatch power. And Julian questioned if his aide thought he hadn't realized that. The red-haired man reflected that he never doubted His Majesty, but always admired his ingenuity and strength in combat. Once, after a victory against a horde of monsters, Collins asked the Lord how he had chosen that tactic. He considered the idea of burning everything around to eliminate cobwebs brilliant, then directing everyone to one place and killing them with one blow. The Emperor replied that he had learned from the Chancellor. At dinner, the guests murmured how good everything looked. It was obvious that the Prime Minister had made a great effort. Someone commented that the banquet was to honor the Emperor, who was on the battlefields. But another replied that things didn't go so badly for him there. No one knows if he regained consciousness after seeing the monster, although someone wondered if he would lose his mind today. A call for prudence was made, as it was said that a lady was left with a scar on her face after meeting the Emperor. Someone expressed a wish that the previous Emperor had had another son. Suddenly, a voice in the hall demanded silence, as His Majesty Julian Valdez had arrived. Seeing the knights escorting the Emperor, the guests whispered, "Are those powerful guardians the much-talked-about army that everyone mentions?" A new question arose. Wasn't the Emperor a clumsy young man, with labored breathing, resembling a useless doll? Many asked who this arrogant young man with straight shoulders and a firm step was. They saw him as a completely different person, but they didn't understand what had happened to him in those 3 years. A gray-haired man walked through the hall, approached the Emperor, knelt down, and greeted him. He informed His Majesty that his humble servant, the Prime Minister, had arrived. Sharn looked at her reflection and wondered, wasn't this revealing and luxurious outfit excessive for a common maid? The head maid asked her to hurry, because she had to pretend to be an imperial concubine at the banquet. Sharn asked for clarification. Wasn't she coming to the banquet precisely to serve His Majesty? Katerina explained that at the banquet, the servant had to play the role of the Emperor's mistress. She added that it was necessary to contain the forces threatening His Majesty's positions. Sharn asked if the head maid really wanted the servant to fight the aristocrats now. She pointed out that she arrived at the palace a month ago, and Catherine assured her there was nothing to worry about, since her only function was that. the woman reported that the emperor was being falsely accused of murdering his wives. The aristocrats believed he hated women. They think he is angry with his mother, who abandoned him, and that the boy only gained power by being his relative. The nobility believes that the mad emperor, who draws his sword upon seeing a woman, is unworthy of the throne. Everyone believes Albert is taking care of the mad emperor, but in reality, he was mocking his disciple. No one knows, and if his daughter becomes empress, power will be concentrated in the hands of the prime minister. Catherine feared that the emperor would only be needed until the new empress became pregnant. She said that Charny must show everyone that the emperor was fine and no longer avoided women. At the same time, she was required to prove that she was special, unique, and unrepeatable in the emperor's life. Meanwhile, during dinner, the emperor participated in courteous chats, and they showed joy for his safe return from the war. Now that peace has arrived, it is time to dedicate oneself to favorite hobbies, like hunting serfs in season. Albert replied for Julian, assuming he was already busy preparing the gladiators. The emperor replied that it was just entertainment. His soldiers were still children, while the chancellor's gladiators were famous all over the world. His Majesty was informed of rumors that Alberto is recruiting his army, which is comparable in strength to the imperial one. Then, the chancellor proposed organizing a friendly duel and comparing the gladiators, since his sons definitely have something to teach the emperor's children. The crowd murmured, discussing the fact that the prime minister addresses his Majesty as an equal. Completely disrespectful and even challenging. Some pointed out that not even between father and son is there such a close relationship, since Albert cares so much for the emperor that he has nothing to worry about. Suddenly, the arrival of Princess Diana Stuart, Lady of the House of Duke Albert, was announced. The sound of heels echoed through the hall. Everyone was tense. The young woman who appeared looked a lot like the previous empress. Even Colin thought it was her. Princess Diana wore a dress identical to the one His Majesty's wife used to wear. The Prime Minister's daughter and future mistress of the palace bowed before the emperor and greeted him as the son of the Imperium. The young woman told herself that everything was going well, as she had greeted the emperor as her father told her to. And the aristocrats were in her favor. She happily concluded that now all that remained was to occupy the empty seat next to His Majesty. But what happened next surprised her. Instead of taking the princess's hand and greeting her, Julian spilled his glass and the wine spread over the seat. He affirmed that his hand slipped and it was an accident, and asked for the chair to be removed, since it was stained. The banquet guests murmured again, shouldn't the princess sit next to the emperor as the future empress? But someone pleaded for silence, otherwise the chancellor would hear him. A situation already uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the prime minister was furious because the young lady couldn't achieve it. Now Julian had given him a pretext to oppose him. The man decided to change the subject and said he had heard a rumor but didn't believe it. That is why he wanted to ask the emperor directly. He recounted that it is said that His Majesty keeps a slave as a maid. The emperor asked if that was forbidden. Then Albert added that everything is permitted for the son of the empire. He clarified that this could damage the monarch's reputation, as he was next to someone who used to take care of picking up horse manure. Again, the crowd of aristocrats murmured, demanding that the emperor reconsider. The empire's reputation could not be stained. They shouted that the ruler could not be surrounded by an ordinary maid. Someone affirmed that the emperor was crazy, as he had killed all his empresses before. But now he keeps a slave next to him. Another person suggested that the emperor wanted to avoid marriage with the prime minister's daughter. They replied that the emperor was young and foolish, and that pressure could be applied to him. And if they criticized him, he would fall back into a state of madness. Julian asked, why did everything fall apart suddenly? No one gives advice. Did they think he had to account to them? The aristocrats replied that it wasn't so, and noticed that a tense atmosphere had settled in the hall. The chancellor grabbed the princess and brought her closer, affirming that since the war had ended, the emperor had to consider an heir. The man assured that, as always, he offered the best to the emperor. That is why he shouldn't stain his noble body. Julian said he didn't understand where Albert intended to go and ordered Colin to read the prepared document. The red-haired boy reported that Lady Stuart would be kept in the palace for 100 days until her suitability as empress was evaluated. The chancellor was surprised that from now on the emperor was no longer that submissive child and humble who obeyed without question. He said he would eagerly await His Majesty's decision, although he was still interested in asking the servant a question. At that moment, in the banquet hall, a female voice sounded that greeted His Majesty and announced her presence. All those present turned and were offended, wondering who she was and why she wore such reckless clothing. Some guessed it was the careless maid, as only pagan serfs can wear that type of clothing. Sharon thought that during her stay in the palace, she hadn't learned to overcome fear or look the aristocrats in the eye. Then she remembered the main governess's advice. She should imagine horses instead of nobles. The girl did so and managed to overcome shyness. She approached the emperor and ran into his arms. She whispered tenderly that she hated His Majesty for leaving her completely alone. Sharon added that now she had nothing to worry about, as the beloved had arrived and was by his side. In the hall, they whispered. Many wondered why the emperor wasn't having an attack, despite how that woman had thrown herself at him. Someone pointed out that the young woman was a true beauty and didn't look like a simple peasant. She was probably noble from the island of Sursum. Moreover, the emperor showed no anger or shouted. Either he was completely mad, or that girl was of noble origin. It seems the prime minister is in a state of shock and cannot grasp the gravity of his situation, while the princess doesn't even dare to look at her father. The chancellor couldn't accept that a stable maid, who was pondering hay just yesterday, was now next to the emperor. The man reflected if his overly proud gaze wasn't excessive, considering that just a short while ago she was trash lying under the feet of the nobility. He perceived a mysterious energy floating around him and decided that this was why the spell cast on the emperor did not work. The prime minister planned to get rid of her before she became a serious obstacle, and expressed surprise. He observed that His Majesty had done well by finding magnificent material in the stable, polishing it a little and turning it into a diamond. Julian pointed out that the prime minister, as always, did not hide his intentions and acted as if he were the emperor. His Majesty asked Albert if he had been taught that even stones can turn into swords if polished correctly. The man replied that evidently he hadn't learned well, by not understanding how trash picked up in a dung heap could turn into a pearl. The emperor said he didn't expect Albert to say something like that, as he himself didn't remember which field he sowed his seeds in. He asked if the chancellor meant that the eyes of the imperial son were worse than his own seeds. Mentally, Julian told Albert that if he was already imagining himself on the throne, he would make even more mistakes in the future. Sharon said she had stopped enduring it, so she would leave first, although she thought she was crazy for sitting on the emperor's knees. Leaving the banquet hall, she exhaled relieved, as she believed everything was finally over, and that it had turned out well. She was glad that the high nobles had believed her act, although it seemed absurd that she sat like that. Probably the emperor was in shock, but how could she act arrogantly in that situation if she was just a servant? The young woman understood that she didn't fit into that lie and had to concentrate on her duties as a servant. The chancellor's harsh words still echoed in her mind. A pearl will not come from a stone picked up from rubble on the ground. It was said that the prime minister had a kind face, but at dinner his gaze was cold, and his hands seemed sharp, ready to attack at any moment. Many aristocrats who supported the chancellor also attended. Sharon found it hard to imagine that now she would have to face them. In the hallway, she heard Lady Stuart and her maid pass by and remembered Catherine's words. The wedding will take place anyway. On one hand, it saddened her because the emperor's power could have been affected by this agreement. On the other hand, she was happy to get closer to the freedom of the contract and the return to her native island. The princess didn't seem as bad as the chancellor, So Sharon decided that Diana definitely had to marry His Majesty so she could go home. Sharon felt Lady Stuart looked sad at dinner. She probably thought the emperor had a lover. Sharon hoped that, after this, the princess would not hesitate to marry. She wanted to explain everything, but she couldn't reveal the plan. She decided to greet the princess and say no more. The future husband would explain it better. When Sharon introduced herself and greeted Lady Stuart, her maid slapped her, demanding she know her place. She looked at the calm expression of Lady Stuart and couldn't believe that this peaceful creature had ordered the maid to hit her. Sharon thought that Lady Stuart was so calm because she simply didn't know that she had gotten into trouble. Sharon said she understood the princess's irritation, and Lady Eaton, the servant, became indignant seeing the impudence of answering back. She raised her hand again to hit, but the princess stopped her. The maid accused that servant of daring to speak to her lady. Sharon was surprised. Was this enough to hit her? And Her Highness asked Lady Eaton not to get angry, as the poor servant might not know the palace rules. Diana asked if the servant was perhaps from the island of Sursum. Sharon replied that she was. Then Diana became interested in whether everyone there was as vulgar as the servant, since she had come to the banquet covering herself with a piece of cloth. Sharon explained that the princess did not know that island well, as the climate there is very hot, and the clothes are made of light fabrics. The young woman clarified that this greatly helps the skin of the inhabitants of Sursum to breathe freely. Her Highness said that according to the servant's story, all the people there walk naked like prostitutes. The young woman thought that the lady's hatred was evident, and it was obvious that the inhabitants of the empire could not comprehend the national dress of the island of Sursum. She couldn't understand why someone who would become the empress of the entire country in the future would speak so disparagingly of another's homeland. Sharon thought in her mind that she felt sorry for the emperor, who would have to be with such a partner all his life. He called her like a lady, but Her Highness became indignant, demanding that the servant call her empress. Sharon pointed out that the princess was not as simple as she seemed, replying that apparently the servant had overestimated her. The young woman told the lady that she looked so calm when she looked up at her from below, sitting on the emperor's knees. She clarified that His Majesty was holding her so tenderly so she wouldn't fall off his knees. Those words provoked Diana's anger. The princess's anger increased when Sharon said that the empire would be deeply grateful to the lady for the humility shown at the banquet. Those words enraged her again. She raised her hand over Sharon, but at that moment, a female voice sounded in the hallway. The head maid asked for an explanation of what noise was here, and behind her were 2 guards. She ordered them to arrest the red-haired girl, who was provoking a fight. But Lady Diana objected that she was her personal servant. But this did not stop the knights. Then the lady ordered them to remove the girl's hands by imperial edict. Catherine said that the princess was not yet empress. She was just a guest in this hall, and it was still too early to start giving orders here. Lady Diana recalled that she was the prime minister's daughter and would soon be empress, and that the head maid should fear the consequences. Catherine pointed out that she knew that Lady Diana had received imperial education, but it seemed that the chancellor had overestimated his daughter. She said she hadn't had enough time to learn the basics of imperial protocol, and approached Sharon. She affirmed that causing physical harm to His Majesty's personal servant was equivalent to treason. Catherine specified that the servant should be hanged. Then she approached Sharon and asked if she was seriously injured. Sharon was in a state of shock, but replied that she probably bit her cheek. Her mouth is full of blood now, and her gums still hurt. Sharon added that it seemed to her that her tooth hurt. Then, the eyes of the princess and Lady Eaton widened even more due to fear and terror. Catherine declared that it was a serious crime. Then the red-haired girl cried, begging her lady to do something. But Princess Diana could do nothing and simply stood in silence. Catherine ordered the red-haired girl arrested until the emperor personally decided the penalty. Going to the emperor's chambers, Sharon wondered if that girl would really be executed. Catalina asked her not to think about it, but Sharon was certainly worried. She was angry, but considered killing someone for a slap excessive. Sharon now understood the importance of being a personal servant, since when she was a slave, she was whipped with a lash. When the girl got permission to enter, she threw open the emperor's door wide and was paralyzed by surprise. The emperor unbuttoned his vest and shirt as he wished to change clothes. He asked the servant to wait a moment. She suggested helping him, but he refused. No tense situation arose, as Sharon and His Majesty were people accustomed to nudity. The emperor asked where she had injured her cheek. At that instant, Sharon's anger overwhelmed her like a wave. She remembered the recent situation where she was told she was just a slave who collected horse manure. So she cooked up an answer for the emperor. She said she had rushed towards His Majesty, tripped, and fallen, reasoning that His Majesty was also an aristocrat. She would occupy the same posture as that lady. Furthermore, it would not be surprising if the imperial wedding was postponed due to conflicts. However, these words hurt the imperial servant girl. She asked the Lord what he thought of Mrs. Stewart. His Majesty replied that it was a silly question, as it was a political marriage. And her feelings carried no weight. Sharon asked if the emperor wouldn't be happy if his wife turned out to be a good person. Moreover, that would certainly improve his insomnia. Sharon supposed that perhaps this way she could be freed from service with a light heart and leave this place. The emperor looked seriously at the servant and asked what she was talking about. Sharon replied that she had said it unintentionally, as she was sure that the lady did not know she was a false lover. She added that today it was confirmed that the future empress is not one of those who will stand by doing nothing. But she was worried that if the lady misunderstood now, after marrying the emperor, problems would arise. The emperor asked what the servant planned to do about it. Charnes replied that they could talk to the princess and explain everything. The young man asked disdainfully why he should explain anything if he was single for the moment. Charner replied that she just wanted the Lord to be happy. Then, the emperor grabbed the servant by the neck and asked if she was not obliged to serve him for the rest of her life with such intentions. He asked her seriously why the servant tells His Majesty that she is loyal to him and worries only about him, while at the same time wanting to escape with that serf. The girl's eyes opened even wider in shock. Then she apologized to the Lord for her arrogance. A moment later, the emperor blushed for some reason, moved away from Charn, and said that he would not practice magic tonight. The girl became indignant and asked why, but His Majesty insisted on his decision. Charn looked at the bottle that was on the Lord's nightstand and remembered how days ago they had argued about this. One day, Charn took the bottle and, because of its particular smell, asked the emperor if it wasn't a strong alcoholic drink. He replied yes, and told her she shouldn't drink it, as it could prevent the medicine from working. She was surprised that the Lord even drank such a thing, since the bottle didn't even have a label. The emperor explained that he started drinking this since he began fighting monsters, adding that he needed something to sleep on the battlefield after fights. Then, the servant lit up with a smile and affirmed that the Lord would not have to drink this anymore. And now this bottle is still in the emperor's room, while the protagonist scolded herself for saying too much. Perhaps for the Lord, this marriage is only a tool to fight for power. But Charn dreamed and said that the marriage should be happy. She scolded herself for expressing her opinion. After all, it is a political marriage organized by the Prime Minister. The young woman reminded herself mentally that she should know her place, not cross the line, and remember that she could leave here soon. The contract with the emperor will end one day, and Pachan will have earned a reputation as a gladiator, escaping together to the island of Sursum. Suddenly, strange sounds reached the ears of the dreaming girl from the Lord's room. The emperor felt like he had been walking alone through a lifeless land for days. His Majesty was exhausted and thirsty. Suddenly, a female voice sounded from the sky, announcing that the son of a tyrant was in his mother's womb. This phrase was familiar to him, as was the next one. His entire lineage would live as sparsely and poorly as this burnt land. Suddenly, the young man tripped over a pile of dust. The voice said that the fire of the curse would always be in his life, just like the witch. whose only trace was dust. The boy's legs, hands, and neck were wrapped by something black, similar to tentacles. He was suffocating and mentally begged for everything to stop, because that spell could not be eternal. The very next instant, the emperor's hands were free, holding a knife. A thought crossed his mind. He could finally end these tortures with his own hands. Suddenly, a bright glow illuminated the young man. He heard the sweet and familiar voice of his servant Sharon. She said she would take away all the sufferings and pains of the Lord. At that moment, the knife in his hand suddenly disappeared. The young man tried to reach his savior and saw a red thread tied to his wrist. Upon waking, His Majesty headed towards his personal servant who was sleeping nearby. The emperor mentally became angry upon discovering that Sharon stuck her nose even into his dreams. He ran his hand over her face. The skin was so soft that for a moment it seemed to him he was under a torrential rain. And he could do nothing about it. Simplement estaba bajo ella y seguia impapendos. It was already very late at night, and the emperor remained seated next to Sharon, looking at the wound on the servant's cheek, and speculated about who might have hit her. It was evident that she was lying when she said she had tangled and fallen. The young man decided to first obtain a report about it from the head governess Catherine, and then ask Sharon again. Suddenly, the young man's attention was captured by the fact that the maid began to stir and move her legs. It seemed to be her habit during sleep. The blanket had practically fallen to the floor, and the emperor fixed it, covering the young woman. He asked in a low voice who would take care of him if the maid caught a cold. The young man mentally noted that he had done it exclusively as a ruler concerned about his subjects. At the same time, there was no tranquility in the mansion of the Duke of Stuart. The father shouted at his daughter because he had already warned her that Julian hated his mother. That is why he always chose simple and sober dresses for her. But the capricious daughter decided to stand out and put on a dress identical to the late empress's. Asking her father for forgiveness, Diana tried to justify herself by saying that men who lose their mother young feel longing for her. She emphasized that at 17, she too had felt something similar. She added that she wanted to help Julian release all those accumulated emotions. That way, gaining his sympathy, Diana said she planned to use all available means to achieve success. The man got angry and asked her who had told her such nonsense. The young woman replied that it wasn't nonsense, that she had read it in a book. Then the father laughed and told her she believed in fairy tales. Then, in a serious tone, he added that human emotions are not as superficial as his daughter thinks. It is simply not so. You cannot heal someone by helping to release emotions. Trust can turn into mistrust from one moment to the next. The father advised her to stop being so foolish and behave like a girl, since in reality everything is not like in books. He pointed out that the story of the Empress had not taught her not to act hastily. Since today, she was behaving like a primitive woman. The man said that his reputation had suffered a lot because of the fight his daughter caused in the Imperial Palace over a guest. She said she was just very sad, as His Majesty hadn't paid her any attention at all. Diana added that she would have corrected herself and acted differently if her father had given her control over the emperor's heart. He rejected the idea, warning that if human minds could be controlled with that, the world would already belong to sorcerers. The young woman threw herself at her father's feet and begged him not to abandon her, as from now on she would not make mistakes with the emperor. She cried that she didn't want to return to those miserable areas. The man replied that, in that case, it was up to his daughter to have a child with Julian. Then the father could live as regent, but even if Diana didn't like it, he wouldn't abandon her. Will he kill her? Upon leaving, the man concluded that it wasn't worth trusting his daughter to achieve anything. Better intensify the magic. However, lately magic doesn't work well on the emperor, probably due to the presence of that servant by his side. The emperor's aide, Colin, shouted happily that the party operation had been a success. Catherine replied that it was not time to draw hasty conclusions. A reddish-haired boy called the head maid mother and refuted that the atmosphere at the event was completely different. It was enough to see the expressive, surprised faces of the elderly aristocrats. The emperor affirmed that it was entirely Charn's merit. Not even the pro-imperial faction dared to object to anything. Collins emphasized that everything will change from now on. End to rumors about His Majesty's attacks upon seeing women. Catherine commented that if another woman had been seated next to the emperor, no one would have believed it. She added that at first, she greatly doubted that the servant would complete this task. However, thanks to her beauty and magical powers, she met all expectations. Suddenly, His Majesty asked who dared to hit his personal servant. The head maid, instead of answering, announced that she had already imprisoned Princess Stuart's servant. The emperor asked which family that servant belonged to. Catherine replied that she was the heiress of Baron Eaton from the western border. He is an ambitious man who wants to participate in the management of central politics. He invested a lot of effort in turning his daughter into the future empress's servant. Collins emphasized that no matter how much you look, the Baron worked hard for the Chancellor. While Catherine was scolding her son, the emperor asked if it wasn't that Baron who was sent a troop to help defend the border. Collins replied that it was so. Moreover, those soldiers were Celtic barbarians who knew how to fight like beasts. The emperor said that now it is clear why the western border has not been violated at all. Catherine pointed out that it is not surprising that Albond agreed to promote Baron Eaton's daughter. The assistant asked if pressuring her too much, just for a slap, would be excessive. Julian pointed out that his beloved servant lost 2 teeth after being hit. Catherine clarified if her gums weren't torn and started bleeding. Collins pointed out that it was ingenious, since one could die from something like that. A few days later, loud banging was heard in Baron Eaton's manor. The ground rose in columns. The fences and enclosures had been destroyed. The owner of the manor approached the guard and asked indignantly, "What idiot dared to shoot at us?" The confused boy told the lord that the attacker had a white lion on his flag. The Baron was also surprised. At the foot of the manor walls, indeed, was His Majesty with his army. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Palace, Collins was asking Charn if she would really have to carry and deliver that large box. The heroine replied affirmatively and thanked the boy for offering to help. He pointed out that it was the national costume of the people of the island of Sursum, and asked the girl if she didn't intend to keep wearing it. Charn replied that she finds her clothes comfortable, although the palace people view national costumes differently. The girl added that she doesn't want a mistaken perception to form about the inhabitants of the island of Sursum in the empire. Furthermore, the housekeeper gave her familiar and understandable clothes for the palace inhabitants. Collins asked what Charn was holding. The girl said it was the blanket the emperor covered her with, but he left at dawn. And she didn't know what to do with the blanket, so she took it to the housekeeper. The red-haired boy said that spring had finally arrived for the lord. Charn was surprised and asked for clarification. Colin affirmed that he hadn't seen His Majesty so kind and tender for a long time. The girl remembered how the lord treated her badly, and said that there was a very complicated relationship between them. She mentioned that she found it hard to understand which of the emperor's facets was sincere. The boy happily concluded that Charn wanted to know him better. He insisted that no one knew him better than he did. After all, he was his childhood friend. That is why Charn could ask the lord anything without feeling embarrassed. The protagonist was intrigued how the emperor would react upon seeing his personal maid approaching his childhood friend. Meanwhile, the emperor's army continued to destroy the defenses of the baron's castle. Since ancient times, it was believed that firing cannons or catapults was a manifestation of His Majesty's will. This is how he punished his subjects for treason. The baron suspected that the emperor had discovered that he was conspiring with the prime minister. The guard asked if they would attack the invading force, but the baron got angry upon hearing that. 3 years ago, no one would have imagined that the emperor was no longer a child fearful of the throne, and that he posed no threat. The baron knew that the victories won on the battlefield were not mere luck. In the war, Julian's ingenuity, intelligence, and other traits stood out. The nobles feared that he would die without leaving an heir. The emperor consolidated his hold on the throne by gathering a loyal army composed of common soldiers, most of whom were simple people from the street. At first the baron panicked, but then he understood that the cannon shots were just a warning. The man decided that if he kept delaying, His Majesty would surely get angry, and he ordered the guard to open the gates immediately. He greeted the lord and called him the son of the Imperium. Suddenly, a desperate woman's scream, calling for her father, was heard. The baron looked up and saw his daughter Janice begging to be saved. He asked the lord why his daughter was in such a terrible state and locked in a cage. Julian explained that there was an incident at the party. Mrs. Eaton hit the face of her personal secretary. The subordinate lost 5 teeth and then coughed up blood for several days. The emperor affirmed that it saddened him greatly, and he came here to announce that he would punish Mrs. Eaton. Although the young woman shouted that it was just a light slap, the baron was deeply disappointed in his daughter. The man was convinced that it was his mistake to give his daughter as a servant to the future empress. But she ended up in the hands of a cruel snake. He knew that according to imperial laws, his little one could be executed. So the gates were already open. The emperor arrived with his army, and the baron didn't even have time to prepare. Since he knew nothing, the prime minister could not ignore that an incident had happened to his daughter's maid. He knew the emperor's plans perfectly, but he didn't warn Lord Eaton, nor did he even send him a message. Did that pig decide to ruin little Janice to get rid of Baron Eaton that way? The only thing left for the man was to kneel before the monarch known for his cruelty and beg for mercy. He begged His Majesty to at least spare his wife and daughter. Julian observed that, apparently, Baron Eaton had a daughter at 40. The emperor added that now it was clear why the young woman behaved so immaturely. Evidently, the baron didn't explain everything properly to her. He commented that he was a merciful ruler, but he forgave Baron Eaton for the last time. Then he ordered Mrs. Eaton released and asked what the man planned to do now. Later, Mrs. Eaton directed a plea to Mrs. Share to forgive her and her family. The protagonist was surprised to hear such a request from someone who recently considered her worse than horse manure. The red-haired girl said that she acted only because of rumors about what was happening in the palace. Cher noted to herself that the emperor probably approached the Eaton family, which made the aristocrat bow her head. It wouldn't hurt her anyway. Janice asked the protagonist if they had forgiven her. When Sharnia felt it, the red-haired girl jumped for joy and shone with happiness. She thanked him and commented how much relief it was. Then she explained that the emperor himself demanded that the offender apologize to the victim. Apparently, he cares a lot about his beloved person. While the protagonist was thinking about how foolish she had looked lying about her cheek, Lady Eaton said she wanted to know her beautiful love story. Suddenly, Janice noticed that Sharn was not wearing clothes from her people, apparently because of her, and that of Princess Stuart. And then, timidly, she said she wanted to give Sharn a little advice. The protagonist didn't have time to answer due to shock, and Janice approached and whispered in her ear that she should distrust Navi. Surely many spectators are wondering right now about the topic Lady Eaton addressed. But the author gives no answer. Instead, he narrates how Julian returned to the palace and stared fixedly at his servant. Sharn began to stutter that she was glad the lord had returned safe and sound, and asked why her attire had changed. She remembered that it was the emperor who insisted that she attend the dinner in her people's attire. The protagonist said she thought the palace inhabitants would feel uncomfortable with such a revealing outfit. The emperor asked if Charn herself felt uncomfortable in those clothes, and she replied timidly, and with doubts that it was so. Julian answered that in that case she could act as she saw fit, and she proposed to the lord that he bring medicine, since he hadn't taken it during her absence, and the emperor agreed. Charn was surprised that the lord had agreed so quickly and didn't even protest, which couldn't stop her from being happy. Then she remembered Janice's words about the lord's affection and smiled even more brightly. It's not surprising that Julian started stuttering when his servant began to think about him so much. After that conversation, His Majesty worked in his office. Suddenly, he heard the squeak of the door opening and voices apologizing for the interruption. Lifting his head, the emperor saw two dark figures in front of him from which a terrifying aura emanated. Julian exclaimed, alarmed about who these strangers were and who had given them permission to enter. The dark figures said they had a gift, but upon seeing the confusion on the Lord's face, they introduced themselves as Catherine and Colin and asked if he recognized them. Colin said that on the battlefield, he had heard the emperor longing for the blueberry pie made by Catherine. Julian affirmed that it was completely true, and his subordinates convinced him to try some. The emperor thanked Catherine and accepted. His subordinates, with a smile, watched as the Lord put bite after bite into his mouth. Suddenly, behind the door, a desperate female scream called Colin, as she had perceived the smell of poison in the emperor's office. When Sharn, Colin, and Catherine rushed into the Lord's office, it was too late. The blonde boy exclaimed about what was happening and who those guys were. Catherine supposed they were simple strangers, dressed in the same clothes as the emperor's servants. The emperor's aide asked what to do with them, but the Lord remained silent. Sharn asked how much His Majesty had eaten, but instead of answering, he simply fell. Hearing Sharn's voice, Julian understood that he had tried for a long time, but without success, as His Majesty ate too much. She mentioned that she had seen those hedges on her island, which appear to be blackberries. But they are extremely dangerous. It seems the poison had already spread throughout his body. It was urgent to find an antidote. Otherwise, the consequences would be terrible. Colin insisted on calling the emperor's personal doctor, but Catherine remembered that even the guard had been corrupted by the criminals. She doubted that a good doctor could be found in the entire court now. Sharn said she could prepare the antidote herself. A little later, the protagonist was already in an herb garden, located an hour's ride from the court. The young woman asked the garden owner if there was a herbaceous plant with small yellow flowers here. The man replied that he knew that plant, but all the available harvest had already been taken to the court. Now it would only be found on those hills over there. Those hills were far away, but there was no other option. Sharon and Colin headed there. On the way, the heroine admitted that it was all her fault. Because of her reckless act, the Prime Minister had used magic so openly. The boy objected that he didn't think so, since the marriage with the princess had not yet been announced. Sharon asked why Alban was not condemned for witchcraft. Colin replied that there were two reasons. Specifically, lack of evidence and political power. Those who pretended to be the emperor's servants were dead. Therefore, there was no conclusive evidence of the crime. Moreover, when Alban was regent of the young emperor, he significantly strengthened his power, both inside and outside the palace. In short, the case would not lead to a capital punishment, and His Majesty could face attacks from the aristocracy. That is why the last dinner was important. The emperor wished to lay the foundation for turning the aristocrats into a pro-imperial faction. Charn felt sadness, realizing that the boy wasn't even angry. He had surely been expecting something like this all this time. Colin pointed out that they had already climbed quite high, but hadn't found plants. Charn proposed splitting up and searching on their own. Several hours had been lost searching for the plant. They couldn't delay, as the toxin was spreading throughout the emperor's body. Sharn mentally begged for the plant to be found, as the toxin could start destroying the Lord's internal organs. Suddenly, the protagonist shouted. She started calling Colin and shouting happily that she had finally found the medicinal plant. The protagonist intended to uproot the plant with the greatest possible precision so as not to damage the roots. Suddenly, a suspicious hiss was heard. It was a snake that attacked Sharn, and being surprised, she screamed. Colin heard it. He ran and anxiously asked what had happened. The protagonist calmly declared that a snake had bitten her, but it wasn't serious. Since it wasn't poisonous, Colin got angry. Were there snakes on that hill? And then he asked why the girl was still holding it. She asked if the boy was hungry. After all, one could roast a snake and eat something. But Colin shouted that she was talking nonsense. She asked what was strange. The boy was interested if girls in her island ate snakes. Charnel replied that it was delicious. But there was no time to chat. It was time to return to the palace. And Colin couldn't assimilate that information. The emperor's condition improved. His face regained color and vitality. Charnel told the head maid that if he took the medicine every 2 hours, he would feel noticeably better. Catherine pointed out that she didn't imagine the young woman knew so much about this, and explained that on her island she traded herbs. She added that she only followed the advice and climbed the hill. She commented that without the young woman, she wouldn't know what to do. The lady pointed out that one of the attackers was dressed like the first maid. Therefore, she became a tool to harm the emperor. Catherine was accepted into the service of the young ruler only because her family was poor and unprotected. She had nothing but her life. Madame expressed that she was incredibly happy that, thanks to Charn, His Majesty was still alive, and they could continue to confront the Chancellor. It seemed to the woman that fate had sent that talented young woman to the palace. Charn replied that the head maid was just flattering her. Then she considered that it would be good if the emperor also believed it, and not just Catherine. Charn affirmed that it was necessary to focus on the present. Then she added that she didn't know the magic used by the attackers. She explained that powerful magic was needed to completely dominate a person's consciousness in such a short time. The more black magic accumulated, the stronger the poison became. A normal person could not endure it in their body. Sharon said it as an example of snakes. As soon as they reach their goal, they fall into the poison and die. In turn, Albin explained to his daughter that magic is never perfect or easy. Even creating an illusion requires great effort. He observed that the effect increases if people physically resemble their target. And hiding the poison requires even more care. The man smiled disdainfully. After all, some slave managed to handle magic and save the emperor. Surely they found a pearl in the manure. The princess said that her father shouldn't have weakened the poison. He should have let them die on that hill. The prime minister asked Diana if she herself couldn't handle a commoner without her father's help. He asked for clarification on whether it was because of the slave's beauty or her skills. The princess angrily replied that it wasn't about that. Albin observed that a sorcerer must not be reckless. A single death in the mountains is too simple. Julian must experience all the cruelty. Meanwhile, the emperor had a dream of falling endlessly into a dark abyss. His feet could not touch the ground. But it didn't resemble a nightmare. Even though he was falling into nothingness, Julian felt the warmth of a body nearby. Upon opening his eyes, the emperor saw the worried face of Charine next to him. She immediately flooded him with questions. How did he feel? Did anything hurt him? Then she supposed the emperor must be hungry and of course ran to the kitchen. Julian tried to stop her. Suddenly, the protagonist's slipper fell off her foot. The young woman slipped and fell to the floor. Julian approached and asked her if she was okay. Then he said there was no rush. She did not react, nor did she even move. The emperor asked if everything was all right. Then Charn asked, "Does that mean your lordship is now disappointed with your personal servant?" Julian was surprised and asked what she meant. The young woman recounted Sir Colin's story about the many negative incidents the emperor has had since he was young. Charn pointed out that then sadness and terror invaded her upon realizing that at any moment something irreversible could happen to his lordship. Then she realized that she sincerely supported His Majesty, not because of a contract, but out of a real sense of duty. Julian noticed that the young woman was trembling and asked what was wrong. Charny replied that his lordship wanted the servant to be a shield against magic. But the shield cracked and his lordship almost died. Charny trusted her magical abilities, but she failed to protect the emperor. The young woman pointed out that she had not kept her promise and supposed that his lordship was surely disappointed in her. Suddenly, the protagonist threw herself onto His Majesty and shouted at the top of her lungs that it would be fixed, and that she would not allow something like that in the future. She swore to prove her worth and begged to be given his trust. Julian frowned and ordered her to get off him first. Suddenly, the protagonist realized what position they were in right now. She jumped back from the emperor as if burned and began to stammer that this was not the kind of test she had in mind. Julian smiled and said there was no need to deny it so desperately, since he hadn't even considered such an outcome. Then he asked the servant if she really thought her lord was a pervert. Julian extended his hand to Sharn and told her to get up, that the floor was cold. The protagonist felt relief at being free from the worry that the emperor would get angry and fire her. She knew that if she wasn't fired, not only she would suffer, but also Pakhan, who had been hired as a gladiator. The protagonist really wanted to succeed, even more so now that the emperor was looking at her without the same harshness as in their first meeting. He asked what that bandage on her ankle was. The woman replied that an interesting situation had occurred in the mountains. Sharn tried to start recounting, but before the emperor could blink, she was already unconscious on the floor. The protagonist briefly returned to lucidity and asked what was happening. Catherine affirmed that it had finally happened, that Sharn was sick. Noticing the confusion on the lord's face, the head maid pointed out that black magic had been used 2 days ago to disguise strangers as if they were close servants of the emperor. Then a cake was baked with toxic vetch and given to his Majesty. He almost died from it. Fortunately, Sharn found certain herbs that helped detoxify the poison. Catherine said that the personal servant spent a whole day preparing the medicine and did not sleep while taking care of the lord. Then, the head servant pointed out that the girl was injured. Her ankle looked terrible. The emperor ordered Catherine to bring medicine to relieve the pain and help healing. When the head servant ran to fetch the ointment, the emperor pointed out how curious it was that it had happened. After all, the woman they called mother had abandoned little Julian and fled out of fear of the prime minister, whereas a simple servant who had nothing but her own life defended him and saved his life. He did not understand why she herself, however, apologized. Why did she come to help him without caring about the harm it caused to her body? Julian concluded that Sharon was crazy worried about him. Suddenly, Collins ran in and shouted that a snake had bitten the girl in the mountains. He didn't appreciate the full danger, because Sharon felt fine and hadn't fainted. The boy examined the injured leg of the sick girl and concluded, what a relief, that it was only a viper bite. Suddenly, the emperor pushed away Collins' hand. His Majesty said that any careless contact could worsen Sharon's health condition. Colin replied that hygiene was indeed important and pointed out that all decisions made by His Majesty turned out to be correct. The emperor asked why suddenly the assistant spoke like that. He explained that he was referring to the emperor's decision to always give Sharon a chance. The young man pointed out that even though the girl was a simple slave, her words were not worthy of trust. But the Lord forgave her and did not kill her. Instead, they granted her freedom from old chains and the opportunity to prove her capabilities to demonstrate her usefulness. Colin affirmed that those had been the emperor's best decisions, as Sharon gives her best. The emperor said that indeed everyone was lucky that this girl was in the palace. But luck requires prudence. And as for Sharon, the lucid thoughts of the emperor's mind seemed to have been swept away by the current. So Julian concluded that his brain is completely useless here. The emperor personally applied the ointment to the young woman's leg and bandaged it, and concluded that this should be enough. However, Sharon took a long time to regain consciousness. Julian called the servant's name several times and asked her to finally wake up. Suddenly, the protagonist opened her eyes. But all Sharon saw was blurry. She called him Pachon without the slightest doubt, the one who was sitting next to the emperor's bed, and murmured that she had missed him a lot. She said he was the only one she had, and asked if Pachon thought they could return together to the wonderful island of Sursum. The emperor was neither offended nor angry with the girl, since she said all that in delirium. The desire to return home is natural, but Sharon was taken as a slave at the age of 17, and endured hard conditions until 20 before arriving at the palace. Julian mentally imagined that Sharon and Pachon would do well upon returning to the free island. What awaits them? Like before, a poor and sad life awaits them. Julian thought that perhaps it would be wiser to settle in the empire to take care of his own interests. and enjoy lights that the island undoubtedly does not have. The boy tried to convince himself that they were just words in dreams, that they meant nothing. But restless thoughts gave him no respite. He mentally begged Sharon not to express her hidden desires so loudly. Because there were those who envied those who could dream so desperately. A few days passed, and everything returned to normal. However, something changed. The housekeeper now supervises everything the emperor ingests. At that moment, the young woman understood that her magic was not as powerful as the chancellor's. Trust and desire alone are not enough to protect the emperor well. Sharon understood that even if she perfected her spells, it was not certain that it would help her face Albin in the future. She didn't know what to do or how to proceed, so she mentally turned to Pachon asking for help. Walking down the hallway, the young woman asked the housekeeper if she could now attend the gladiators' training. Catherine asked with disapproval if she wanted to meet Pachon, that slave. At that instant, Sharon understood that Catherine would probably deny the request, given the current tense situation. However, the woman indicated that the young woman could go after a snack. But she had to inform the emperor first. Sharon barely opened her mouth to thank the head housekeeper when, suddenly, Lady Stuart appeared in her way. She said she had heard that the emperor was not doing well and decided to visit him. Catherine greeted Princess Diana and commented that she would accompany her to the reception room. Sharon mentally observed that Lady Stuart's appearance was very different from how she looked at dinner. Now she looks reserved and full of dignity, like a true empress. The princess greeted the wisest ruler and the son of this empire. Julian said he greatly appreciates that the young lady took the time and decided to visit him. Then he said the tea is ready. Diana mentioned that she worried a lot when she heard that the emperor was sick, and hopes that now he is completely recovered. Julian replied that as she sees, everything is fine now. There was a small incident, but it was resolved a long time ago. Internally, Diana was indignant that the emperor could speak so carelessly about it and call it a small incident. The Imperial Palace was in disarray because of the food that His Majesty ate, a poisoned cake. But now Julian seemed normal, so Diana could breathe a sigh of relief, although she didn't understand the reason for trying to kill the emperor before their wedding. The girl was intrigued if the ruler had really identified the magic. If the servant from the Sur Island possessed such ability. Well, it seems everything is not going as her father planned. Sharon apologized and said she had to leave. Julian replied that everything was fine. Sharon can go about her business, but the princess didn't miss the opportunity to talk to the departing young woman. Diana asked for clarification on her name, as she had forgotten it, and apologized for her maid's rude behavior at dinner. Then she asked the girl, since they almost share a husband, why not try to get along as family? The protagonist was already shocked, but the following words left her devastated. Diana pointed out that the question of who would give birth to the imperial heir would first be especially delicate. The girl mentally noted that she was just a lady-in-waiting to His Highness, and that she would be happy if someone appeared who sincerely loved him. Moreover, it would mean that Sharon could finish her service and return with Pachon to her native island. Julian thought sadly and in despair if Sharon would also abandon him. He was familiar with the feeling of rejection, as once they convinced him to continue living with hatred towards her, and use that hatred to endure all of life's difficulties, because he would be the emperor, and she a free woman. He remembered that that woman didn't shed a single tear until the end, and Julian also tried to restrain himself. Although his eyes were moist, he often wondered if it would have been better if he had cried and clung to her. Perhaps yes, because all her repressed tears turned into a fear that relentlessly tortured the monarch. The situation is exactly the same now. Julian returned to the reality of his thoughts thanks to a question from Princess Diana. She asked if His Majesty was feeling unwell again. He replied that everything was fine, he was just thinking nonsense. When Diana looked at him, she doubted whether someone in real life could be so beautiful. He resembles a rose with thorns, impossible to approach, unreachable and unwilling to show his vulnerable side. But there is someone who finally managed to attract the emperor's attention. It is Sharn, born among slaves on the island of Sursum, his lover. When that girl from the island walked away, Diana noticed how the emperor's eyes darkened with anger. It was a deep feeling. After that look, Diana made a decision. At all costs, she would conquer His Majesty's heart. How easy it would be if, like a fool, she had given in to Julian's attractive appearance. But on the other hand, her heart was not ready to fall in love. Moreover, men like him cannot make a woman happy. Diana decided to take advantage of the situation, to gain any possible advantage. The idea of using a love filter capable of making her target fall in love came to her mind. It was risky, but it was worth a try, because if she finally managed to become empress and give birth to the heir, her life would change forever. The princess smiled and told the emperor that she had prepared something special for him. Julian didn't even suspect what it was. She said she had heard that sleeping next to the aphrodisiac, so that it would absorb the aroma of your body, made it more effective. So she spent several nights like that, but still doubted whether the filter would work on a man so obsessed with another. Suddenly, the emperor stood up abruptly and headed somewhere. The princess tried to stop him, but only received apologies from the emperor. He explained that he had to leave urgently to finish pending matters, and he wished the princess to return home safe and sound. At that moment, the cheerful Sharn ran to meet Pachon. She threw herself into his arms and told him she had missed him a lot. The young man asked if Sharn was okay. She replied that, of course, since she works in the Imperial Palace. She added that the housekeeper also took care of her. Pachon listened to Sharn's story sadly, as he was sure she was lying. She even looks thinner than when she was a slave. He understood that, although his friend said everything was fine, in reality she had to fight for many things. Suddenly, Pachon asked the girl to wait a little, until he trained well and surpassed the competition. Sharn protested, saying no way, and if Pachon suffered during the battles. She maintained that perhaps, in her friend's eyes, he looked weak, but what she saw was not everything. Sharn can trust him. If a gladiator defeats an opponent in the arena, he has the right to ask his lord for something. Pachon explained that the gladiator can ask the lord for anything, and he must fulfill it. So the girl must wait a little. The boy promised that he would definitely win. To be able to return together to the island of Sursum, Sharon nodded in agreement. It was almost night when Pachon returned to the training ground. He realized that everything was tenser than usual and decided to ask what had happened. They advised him to look up, and Pachon saw that up there, on the podium on a throne, His Majesty was sitting. The boy bowed and greeted the supreme ruler and the son of this empire. Julian slowly descended from the podium and asked the gladiator if it was true that his name was Pachon. The emperor pointed out that he had heard that the boy had good skills, even being a slave from an island. Julian proposed to the frightened boy that he show his gladiator skills, that they face each other in the arena. And they will fight. A while later, the gladiator stood before the emperor, holding a sword with trembling hands. Obviously, Pachon had no choice but to say it was an honor for him, and that he would do everything possible. But the emperor affirmed that if this was an honor for the boy, they would know only after the battle ended. And the battle would end only when one of the participants surrendered. And surrender meant death. When their swords clashed, Pachon thought it was an unexpected opportunity. But not so bad in reality. If he acted well now, he could return home with Sharon. All of Pachon's hopes vanished, as it turned out that the emperor handled the sword excellently. Everyone was surprised to see the gleam of His Majesty's blade flashing in front of the gladiator's face. Julian knocked the boy down with his quick thrusts. Apparently, Julian got very excited, and with a cruel smile murmured that it would be a glorious death for a slave. Suddenly, someone stopped his hand. It turned out to be Colin, who treated everything as a joke and suggested finishing the training and returning home in an animated tone. His Majesty's aide scrutinized the wounded Pachon and partially understood why he was so angry. But killing a useless servant will change nothing. Suddenly, the emperor called Colin and asked if that servant shouldn't fight Marcus. The reddish-haired boy supposed the lord was joking. since Marcus is the strongest imperial gladiator. He has won 20 battles, killing 18 opponents and leaving the other 2 permanently disabled. The emperor smiled suspiciously and said it was just a joke and proposed it because that servant had fought well. Suddenly, the wounded gladiator's cry reached Julian's ears. He couldn't give up like that. He begged the Lord to give him another chance, as he was willing to do anything to win the battle. His Highness advised the servant to remember his place. Pachon timidly replied that he really could do it. The emperor commented that if he felt so confident, he should first defeat all the local gladiators. Back at the castle, Julian was thinking about why Pachon was so pathetic. Why does he do it? Why does he face the battle so bravely? Why does he desperately beg for another chance? Is that why Sharon met him behind the Lord's back? Does he like him that much? Julian thought he shouldn't see her in any other way than as a simple servant. That every night she uses magic to help His Majesty sleep, since he cannot do it himself. Only a contract binds them, nothing more, nothing less. Suddenly, the assistant's question about whether the Lord likes her brought Julian out of his thoughts. Sharon. The emperor didn't even believe it at first and asked for clarification. Collins pointed out that he knows the Lord doesn't usually fall in love with anyone. He added that he was asking because now His Majesty was behaving exactly as if he had feelings for the servant. The emperor advised him to think before speaking. The young man noticed that there were no longer reasons to be so rude to the gladiator. Probably the emperor would get angry with Pachon because of something between him and Sharon. He advised him not to complicate anything and not to fear calling things by their name, as it was simple jealousy. Julian replied that the son of the Imperium could not feel emotions for someone like any ordinary person. He should simply possess without clinging to anyone. It would be absurd for the supreme ruler to surrender to the heart of a common woman. When His Majesty tried to explain to Collins that it was a misunderstanding, Sharon appeared and cheerfully greeted the emperor. She said she would help the Lord and would take his sword. At the servant's touch, Julian's heart beat strongly and his cheeks flushed. The protagonist pointed out that the sword turned out to be much heavier than it looked. Then she asked why it was stained with blood. Did he send another warhorse this time? The emperor at first didn't understand what it was about, but then he suspected and asked if it wasn't human blood. He laughed and said it was impossible, as it wasn't a battlefield. Moreover, the emperor was not someone who committed reckless acts with a weapon in hand. He wondered if the servant had a good opinion of him, and wondered how she would react upon discovering that it belonged to Pachon. Julian decided that, in reality, Charny didn't know him at all and suspected nothing of how far he was willing to go to achieve what he desired. She did not know that Emperor Julian didn't mind having feelings for something he wished to possess. The emperor approached the young woman and asked her how long he could continue behaving like a good man towards her. Charny lay in bed, reliving the emperor's words. He was not a good man and didn't intend to pretend to be. What interested him was whether this meant the young woman should always remain by his side and serve only him. Moreover, there was another situation that did not leave the protagonist calm. It happened a few days ago, when she brought him red threads and explained that she had brought them specifically to tie them around his ankle. The emperor looked at the ball of thread with distrust and asked if the young woman thought that thread was strong enough. It seemed to him that the thread might not hold and break. Sharn replied with a smile that, even if that happened, they would simply take another thread. However, the young woman noticed that instantly His Majesty's face darkened. So she asked what was wrong. Instead of answering, the emperor threw the ball of thread far away and grabbed Sharn by the neck. The protagonist begged the Lord to stop, but he remained unyielding. Her tears were already running down the emperor's hand, but he kept tightening his grip on Charn's neck harder. Suddenly, as if he had recovered, he let her go with surprised eyes. He asked what had happened. The young woman mentally observed that the emperor was not pretending. He was sincerely surprised and looked like someone who had just woken up. It was not surprising that His Majesty was agitated, as he had recently suffered an attack in his own palace. and the attackers were disguised as those in whom he fully trusted. Meanwhile, Lady Stuart left the palace for a walk under the starry sky. And she reflected on how the emperor could simply leave, even if he wasn't particularly interested in her. Why act so rudely? Her father had once told her that he didn't understand how someone born female didn't know how to attract a man's attention. A true beauty only needs a smile and a look. But what can the daughter do? Diana sadly concluded that she was not born as a true beauty and lacked that gift. What can she do then? She didn't even manage to give the elixir to the emperor. Suddenly, the princess heard strange screams that sounded like a fight. She wondered who could be training at this hour, since all the emperor's knights should be preparing for sleep. Peeking around the corner, Diana discovered a gladiator from the Imperial Palace. Pachon by name. He noticed the lady and asked if she was lost. Diana replied that she went out for tea during a walk and somehow ended up here. She was lying, since there was alcohol in the cup. Meanwhile, Pachon introduced himself and mentioned his position. The young woman noticed that the boy has an unusual name and also exotic features. The gladiator offered the young lady to show her the inner palace garden, and as soon as Diana accepted, a noise was heard in the bushes. She moved her away and asked her to wait while she checked. A puppy or maybe a kitten came out of the bushes. The princess said it was Navi, her cat, that grandfather sent. He cannot take his careless granddaughter's eyes off her for a moment. Of course, he doesn't want to take his eyes off her for a moment. Pachon said that this is how it immediately occurred to him. Of course, the cat was only following its owner. Furthermore, it wore a gold collar. The girl reacted favorably to the boy's words, probably because she had drunk alcohol, and felt a little intoxicated. She felt uncomfortable and threw him a mischievous look. But suddenly, she screamed loudly because blood appeared on the gladiator's neck. She asked him if he was injured. Pachon replied that it was only a light wound, suffered during training. Diana became so nervous and confused that she handed him her handkerchief and offered to dry the bleeding wound. Of course, for a moment she felt sad, since that handkerchief was intended for Julian. But perhaps he didn't care about the girl. Diana was initially skeptical about this spell, as she didn't believe the love potion would work. However, now she is completely sure that it was nonsense. Pachon thanked the princess for the handkerchief and said he didn't even know how to repay this gesture. The girl said it wasn't necessary, since the boy's expression reminded her of a puppy's. Furthermore, Diana was happy to have helped her companion, who had accompanied her during the night walk. A while later, in a special room, the emperor was holding a meeting of the nobles. Lord Albin became interested in the emperor's health condition from now on. Because, being an old man, he was terribly frightened upon learning that the young ruler was ill. Julian only smiled, staring fixedly into the chancellor's bold eyes. He said there was no need to worry, as it was just a mousetrap he was complaining about. The chancellor pointed out how funny the words the emperor had chosen were. But didn't he find it a bit inappropriate? The man reminded Julian that since childhood he had taught him to watch what he said. And did. All other members of parliament shrank in fear and sat in silence like mice. Alban thought that if His Majesty had dared a little, it didn't mean they could walk all over him. He asked if how about a home tournament, since the terrain of his property was ideal for home grounds. Then, the Prime Minister added that he proposed all this exclusively to celebrate His Majesty's recovery. Julian said it sounded interesting, but he had no intention of participating since organizing such an event. And for so many people would require great efforts. Not to mention the budget, the Chancellor smiled and said not to worry since he himself was organizing the event. He would make sure everything was well prepared, without failure. Then he apologized and said he needed to leave urgently. Colin asked if a hunting tournament on the Chancellor's lands didn't sound suspicious. His Majesty clarified that it was obvious that Albin wanted to show the entire society that he was more competent than the Emperor. Albin cannot be left unpunished just like that. Evidently, he decided that the Emperor's plate is his personal testing ground for culinary experiments. Julian proposed breaking the Chancellor's back so he would learn that touching other people's plates without permission is bad manners. Colin pointed out that the Chancellor's lands are essentially enemy territory. Who knows what dangers are hidden there? To top it all off, the Chancellor has a dangerous private militia. The Emperor asked if there wasn't a safer and more effective method. His assistant came up with a brilliant idea. Could His Majesty take advantage of his face this time? The Emperor didn't understand at first, until his assistant clarified that it was the perfect time to take maximum advantage of his face. After all, seducing Lady Dane Stuart and gaining her loyalty would be an effective strategy. The Emperor was indignant. Why not try this dishonorable method himself if he likes it so much? Over the years, Albin sent many spies, including beautiful women. None managed to win His Majesty's favor. Then, Colin reconsidered the indifferent lord's capacity to love. But now it was different. The red-haired boy added that Lady Stuart would undoubtedly end up being Empress, although the subsequent events depended on the Emperor. Julian asked what the assistant meant. Colin advised the Lord to see it as a strategy to maintain the throne. He recalled that His Majesty swore to live exclusively as Emperor, not as a common man. Julian observed that this was true, as he swore to erase from his heart everything that did not lead to the throne. The Emperor thought that if he decided, he could use the Chancellor's daughter as he wished. Colin is right. The main thing is to possess without involving feelings or emotions, but in reality, it is so simple. Julian understood that he was just a little confused. He had never felt anything like this. It would pass soon. For the Emperor, feeling emotions is a mortal weakness. Better eradicate it from the beginning. A little later, something interesting happened in the Imperial Palace. Lady Stuart thanked His Majesty for the invitation. The Emperor kindly greeted the guest and invited her to sit at the table. He pointed out that he had reflected well and understood that his words sounded rude last time. The Emperor asked to clarify what happened at the last meeting. The princess asked if he didn't remember. She recalled that she visited the palace without prior notice and distracted the Emperor without knowing how busy he was. His Majesty apologized. After all, leaving in the middle of a conversation was clearly impolitic. Diana thought that dialogue took her breath away. Talking with Julian was as difficult as with her father. She decided to change the subject and mention that her father was preparing hard for the hunting tournament. The Emperor replied that he was looking forward to it. At that moment, Charn appeared. The princess asked if Julian had invited that girl to lunch. The young woman said she had brought wine. She hoped the princess would appreciate it and that she wouldn't bother and left. The girl saw that they were chatting animatedly, probably busy with their affairs. Diana stopped Charon and asked if she was just leaving like that, and proposed that she stay for at least a toast. The protagonist was surprised and replied that she appreciated the proposal, but she didn't drink. The princess insisted that she sit down. The Emperor added that refusing the good intentions of a superior was impolitic. Sharon had to agree. The princess smiled and told Sharon that it turned out they were on the same wavelength on this issue. She confessed that a noble lady should know wines, but unfortunately, her taste receptors refused to cooperate. Julian affirmed that this wine was especially for lunch. That's why it wasn't too strong, and Lady Diana would take it well. The protagonist thought that the Emperor's voice was very soft. She didn't even know he was capable of speaking like that. The princess asked if His Majesty was so kind when insisting. How could she refuse? The ruler of the Imperium and the daughter of a prestigious aristocratic family, the Stuarts. They complemented each other perfectly. Sharon understood it completely. She also understood her true status and remembered that she was only a servant. The whole palace knew it, that His Majesty's madness had ceased. Therefore, as soon as that political marriage was celebrated without complications, the protagonist could finally leave the palace. But did Sharon even have to continue pretending that she was the object of His Majesty's attention at those moments? The girl pointed out that the Emperor and the princess formed a harmonious couple. Diana thanked her. She said that Sharon also looks good with the Emperor. The heroine mentally noted that it was all fake, as they only drank and laughed together. The princess asked if Sharn thought there was someone better suited for him. After that question, the emperor began to stare fixedly at the servant and follow her reaction. The protagonist blushed. Julian frowned and commented that, although delicious, the meat was tough. Diana noticed Sharn's negative reaction and decided to change the subject. Diana was worried, as the tournament required riding a horse and she was a beginner. The emperor proposed going to the tournament with the princess. At first she hesitated, as she remembered Sharn's reaction. However, after thinking for a moment, Diana accepted, smiling at the thought that the girl from the island surely got along well with horses. The protagonist had no choice but to accept. Although before, she only worked in the stable as a slave and did not know how to ride a horse. These memories made her so bitter that she wanted to drink something. Evidently, such an attitude did not go unnoticed by the princess and the emperor. The protagonist was surprised by the good taste and suddenly understood why alcohol is popular among people. Sharon licked her lips satisfied. Julian was in a state of shock. He, smiling mentally, observed that his servant had an astonished look. But then he wondered why he looked at Sharn eagerly, if she was just his personal servant. The emperor noticed, surprised, that although she belonged to him, he looked at her as if she were an unattainable jewel. Diana caught that look and thought it was touching. He burned with passion, but she didn't even look at him. Her feelings for him are not comparable to his obsession. Diana reflected that, to achieve the title of empress, she had to avoid conflicts. Especially with Sharn, as it could be dangerous. Sharn apologized for her behavior and promised not to drink another drop of alcohol. But she clarified playfully that the wine was offered by the emperor, so everyone had to obey. And try it. Sharn overwhelmed her useless life. She hoped that a glass of wine would help her, at least for a moment. Then she apologized and left in a hurry, clearly ashamed and saddened by the situation. The emperor couldn't help but look after the servant who was moving away. After the meal, Julian thought intensely about his feelings for Sharn, and noted to himself that enormous shame harbored in his soul. He called himself stupid, as he had been trying to forget Sharn for a long time, but his thoughts didn't let him. Julian said ironically that, apparently, he wouldn't be able to sleep today either, and wondered where his personal servant would be, when he needed her so much. Suddenly, Catherine appeared, and observed with surprise that His Majesty had already returned. She asked the head chambermaid about Sharn and looked around worriedly. The lady warned that the girl had dined with the emperor. She added that she had just cleaned and checked all the rooms, but Sharn was nowhere to be found. The emperor replied that the maid was right and explained that Sharn had drunk too much and had retired, probably to get some air. Catherine pointed out that Sharn never disappeared like that, willingly, much less when the Lord needed to take his insomnia medicine. The emperor desperately pondered how it could have happened that his thoughts and dreams were completely under someone else's control. His Majesty concealed the search for the servant, although Catherine tried to resist. He said she was probably somewhere in the garden. There was no need to worry. But even upon returning and changing clothes, Julian couldn't calm down or move away from his worries about Sharon. Although it was very late, he left his chambers and headed somewhere. The guards tried to stop him, but he ordered them not to ask unnecessary questions and to stay in their place. Julian's chest was tightly compressed. His heart beat fast. He tried to remain calm despite the shock or anxiety. Suddenly he knew where Sharn had gone. She was clearly heading towards that slave. Diana's question remained engraved in the emperor's mind. Did Sharn think there was someone more suitable for him? Of course, it was absurd that a simple slave caused so much concern for the emperor. Suddenly, Julian came up with the idea that Sharn's actions were an obvious betrayal of his lord. Since it was the third time she had disappeared aimlessly, ignoring her obligations. Passing by the stables, His Majesty noticed a light coming from there. He decided to take a look, and the emperor found Sharn sleeping in the hay, and wondered if the young woman had drunk so much that she got drunk. But this behavior was absolutely unusual for her. Julian was surprised. He couldn't find the words, but still decided to take the servant back inside the palace. The young man remembered that he had sworn before to renounce feelings for his personal servant forever. He understood that if he took her back to the palace now, he would never be able to get her out of his head later. Julian gently ran his finger over Sharn's cheek and mentally asked what he should do with his subordinate. It was already night. As usual, Princess Diana went out for a night walk after dinner. She was devising plans to conquer the empire, analyzing the weaknesses of her father and the emperor. Of course, the best option would be for her to give birth to a prince, and in the end, only he would remain. So the empire would be at her feet. But to carry out this plan, initially these two were needed. But the emperor is blind because of his love for another woman, and the prime minister is unpredictable because of his greed. Diana was at a dead end, as she didn't understand how she could conquer this country. She decided that, for now, she had to endure these two to be able to use them and achieve her goal. But the princess was a cold pragmatist ready to get rid of them if they later became a threat. The moon had risen high and shone brightly. Diana thought that on moonlit nights like these it was best to get drunk, but she regretted having been restrained. And restrain herself. It would be better to get really drunk than to pretend. Her Highness shouted to her servant that she no longer needed her company, as she wished to walk alone. Suddenly, something caught the girl's attention. Polished pebbles glistened on the ground. The finding seemed suspicious. Everything looked artificial. It could be a mark or a trap. But suddenly, Diana remembered her recent encounter with Pachon. Then she asked him if the lady had accidentally gotten lost during her walk. Then, Her Highness guessed that this boy had placed the mark intentionally, thinking that the princess was lost again. Suddenly, she heard a noise. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Palace, they were looking for the protagonist at that moment. Collins complained that he was already tired and didn't understand why the emperor suddenly sought Sharn so intensely. It was surprising. The mother's behavior made the blonde boy smile as she pretended indifference. But in reality, she was very worried. She begged him not to stop searching and to keep the guards on alert, since Sharn is crucial for the emperor to sleep peacefully. Colin wondered if His Majesty had finally made a decision, and Catherine asked what he meant. The young man replied that she herself understood it perfectly. The housekeeper understood that the son was implying a connection between the emperor and his personal maid. That everyone perceives but dares not mention. The lady started shouting furiously at her son and denied everything, calling their relationship just a show. Julian is fanatically stubborn in his interests. Be it books, fencing, or anything else, he takes things to the end. In short, he is much more relentless than he appears. Behind his gentle appearance hides an inflexible will. He is not one to abandon someone for love. For Julian, love is possession, not freedom. This stubbornness can also affect Sharon. Catherine said that is why she tries to stop this dependence before the Lord goes completely crazy. Sharon has an unbreakable will. She fights for her independence despite her subordinate status. She is like a small fish escaping the fingers when they try to catch her. Catherine said that Colin's task is to ensure that His Majesty never fully understands his feelings, that he believes it was just a passing illusion. The red-haired boy wondered if the price of the Lord's tranquility was a protective lie. But who would benefit from it? Colin was indignant at the absurdity of the situation. He understood that they were asking him to deprive the emperor of his feelings under the pretext of the Imperium's well-being. The imperial aide understood that Sharn, being an ex-slave, could hide in a secluded place. And inaccessible. Suddenly, some noise reached him. Listening carefully, Colin realized that it was laughter coming from the corner. But when the boy looked around the corner, his breath caught as he saw Pachon there, and Princess Diana laughing. Colin watched the secret meeting of those two with surprise and didn't understand why they were there, strolling together under the moon. And most importantly, Pachon is the man Sharn likes, but according to his expression and behavior, he didn't seem to fear Princess Diana. Colin noted with irritation that, at a time like that, His Majesty was nowhere to be found. At that very moment, the emperor was busy with something important. He could not admit that he needed Sharn not as medicine, but as a beloved. That's why he hid behind documents. The contract with Sharn remains valid until the insomnia disappears and the emperor gets married. This explains why Sharn cannot simply be released, regardless of her status or feelings. Keeping Sharn close is also important for political calculation, as Albert is a threat to the throne. As long as he is not neutralized, the emperor needs Sharn. Julian decided to turn around and leave, as the emperor's promise must be fulfilled. But not a minute passed when he rushed back in, full of panic. The emperor couldn't just leave a drunk woman alone. Only scoundrels would do that. Julian convinced himself that he would only watch over the girl until dawn, and then return as if nothing had happened. Sharon scolded herself for having completely lost her head, as she had slept in the stable completely drunk. Sharon thought that if the head maid found out, everything would be over for her. A disgruntled Sharn appeared before his face. The girl was horrified. She said that tomorrow is the trip to the home championships in Rivers. Everything must be prepared in advance, and also make sure His Majesty suffers no discomfort. And the protagonist promised herself not to drink even a drop starting today. A while later, Sharn arrived at the emperor's chambers and apologized to him. Looking down, she explained that she didn't remember how she returned to the chambers last night and should have woken up earlier to prepare everything for breakfast. The emperor coldly pointed out that, evidently, even too much wine during dinner is enough to lose one's mind. Sharn was nervous. Her trembling fingers betrayed the fear. The emperor spoke disdainfully, watching her blush. The girl timidly proposed canceling her participation in the hunt, as she would only hinder His Majesty. And the princess? Julian didn't understand at first what the servant was talking about, so he clarified that he just wished they would get along well with each other. His Majesty advised the servant not to invent nonsense and to fulfill her duties. He told her not to meddle in his affairs and to know her place, as it is not for a servant to be interested in the future empress. The day of the hunting tournament has arrived. The guests whispered indignantly, wondering how the monarch's lover had disappeared. They wondered in disbelief if the emperor had finally chosen Diana. Others replied that understanding the tyrant was not simple. Suddenly, Giuliano's eyes opened wide, and the rest of the aristocrats could not look away either. All those present fixed their gaze on the beautiful Sharn. The gossip started whispering again, wondering if she was the young woman the emperor singled out. They acknowledged that it was no wonder the court murmured about her beauty. But they were intrigued as to who the person sitting next to her was. The aristocrats present wondered why they were traveling together. While watching, Diana sadly reflected on what they were plotting. Before leaving, Colin told the emperor that he would take over the Lord's care that day. So he had nothing to fear. Then Giuliano agreed and replied that he trusted the young man. But now he regretted his decision and sighed bitterly as together Sharn. And Colin looked even more harmonious than he had imagined. Everything seemed as if the royal wedding had already taken place. Suddenly, Sharn exclaimed in surprise as the housekeeper passed right in front of her, who looked simply magnificent. Catherine sadly said it was a pity that women couldn't be knights, since she could definitely have achieved it. With a smile, Colin proposed to his mother to organize a competition and check who would reach the shore first on horseback. He added that he missed their competitions, but Catherine replied with disdain that it wasn't worth wasting energy, since she would win anyway. The young man asked if the emperor would compete. He inquired seriously to the assistant if he thought the Lord had ascended the throne for no reason. Catherine announced loudly the change, saying she would ride first. Colin affirmed that if his mother had been a knight, she would have been braver than Jalek. Sharn asked for clarification, asking if the young man was talking about that female knight who cursed the royal family. Colin confirmed Sharn's supposition and explained that at that time, she was unjustly condemned for witchcraft. Now her name is free from shame and history has restored justice. Sharn wondered if she had been condemned despite all her loyalty to the country. It also surprised the protagonist why Colin spoke about it so calmly. The protagonist shouted that Colin should move faster. Otherwise, he would arrive last at the finish line. The boy smiled and said that when someone you care about gets ahead, it's one thing. But much more painful is when they disappear without a trace behind. Sharon asked what he meant by those words. Colin replied that nothing serious. And certainly not, since Mom would reach the shore first. But according to him, His Majesty looked back with every step he took. The girl confirmed that lately the Lord had seemed strange. Colin asked then what strangeness he had shown. The girl replied that lately the Emperor had become much colder towards her. Sharon wondered if perhaps she had made a mistake that caused His Majesty to become so distant. She also suspected that there might be another problem of which she was unaware. But she was willing to do whatever necessary to fix it. Colin said she shouldn't pay attention to it, since the Emperor was always a cold person. Sharon replied that it was an unusual coldness. Apparently, the Emperor didn't even want her by his side. The girl said that such a stressful job exhausted her quite a bit. Better to eliminate the manure than to walk on eggshells every day. Meanwhile, events lead us to the Chancellor's residence. A rat ran towards the piece. Suddenly, a sound was heard in the bushes. A cat jumped out of the bushes. Quickly its mouth caught the small and defenseless animal. Now the public's task is to guess what the author meant and if it was an allegory to something. Finally, all the guests arrived at the home competition and settled in the tents. As expected, Colin and Sharon arrived last. The boy said he needed to see His Majesty first. He asked what Sharon would do, but she replied that for now she would sit in the shade. Colin promised to see each other later, and the girl went to the trees and met Princess Diana. Diana happily exclaimed that she finally saw Sharon here. The heroine was confused and clearly not happy with the encounter. The princess said she just wanted to chat with the ladies, but in reality Sharon didn't interest her. Although she had no choice. Meanwhile, Colin asked the Emperor if he wasn't intrigued as to why the assistant. And Sharon had arrived late. Julian raised an eyebrow disdainfully and commented that he knew about the assistant's kidnapping skills. The young man replied that it wasn't exactly that, only that on the way they had a very entertaining chat with the girl. He murmured offended if the Lord didn't care about the topics, and His Majesty emphatically denied wanting to know anything. Colin continued talking about how well they got along with Sharon. And only when the irritated Julian took his sword did the red-haired boy finally understand. He said it was time to visit his new friend. But when leaving the imperial tent, he saw Albert with the secretary. Well, what a surprise. The Chancellor's visit to the Emperor boded no good, although apparently His Majesty maintained his composure. Colin hesitated whether to trust his instincts when seating Lady Stuart in front of him on the horse. But it's not advisable to meddle in what doesn't concern us. Until not long ago for Julian, Dinah was as desired as Albert. But now, even if he didn't like it, he accepted reality and his destiny. After all, the burden of the crown is always heavy. Anyway, everything turned out well. Between Sharon and the Emperor, there was nothing and there could be nothing. Now each will accept the fate designated in their place. Someone said it was an excellent opportunity to visit the Chancellor's residence. They say it was built by a famous architect from the Florentine Empire, calling it a true work of art. Albert laughed and assured that there was nothing special, that he had simply seen a cozy farm in Florence. And he wanted to build something similar. Julian smiled disdainfully and thought it was an impertinence to call a luxurious mansion built with the people's taxes a farm. The monarch was surprised by Albert's false humility. He just wanted to show off to the nobility, just to demonstrate how much authority Chancellor Waldeck has, whose wealth exceeds that of the imperial family. For a politician as experienced as him, the young emperor is nothing more than a child. Julian, with a smile, said that he was also interested in seeing the Chancellor's magnificent palace. Then he clarified that he had forgotten to call a farm a palace. Albert forced a smile and said it was just a farm, not worthy of being shown to the emperor. Julian replied ironically that it was very regrettable, and inwardly called the chancellor a greedy old man. The cat jumped off the chancellor's legs to walk and hunt. Curiously, none of those present had noticed that the cat's collar was stained with blood. Meanwhile, the ladies organized a snack, commenting on the emperor's kind attitude towards Lady Stuart today. Diana stammered, blushing that if it was that obvious, now she even felt uncomfortable. Charn perceived a pleasant floral aroma, as if she were in the heart of the forest. This aroma seemed to return her to her native island, Sursum, and the princess turned to her asking if she liked this infusion. She clarified that it was one of the exclusive varieties produced in the imperial territory. In a playful tone, Diana commented that, unlike wine, tea is hot. So Charn shouldn't drink it all at once. Charn thanked the princess for her care and heard mocking and suppressed laughter from the maidens. One of the girls apologized, since if a girl is from the island of Sursum, it is understandable that she doesn't know the basic rules. Her friend recommended to Charn that, instead of choosing dresses, she should study protocol, since seducing men only with the body won't work for long. Faced with those criticisms from the princess's maids, the protagonist felt anger and surprise. So the princess wasn't worried about Charn, but only wanted to humiliate her. But between His Majesty and the girl from the island, there is nothing, and yet Lady Stuart gets angry. A woman who only shines on the outside cannot heal the emperor's wounded heart, nor establish a true bond with him. Is that why His Majesty has become so cold lately? Could Charn have made a mistake? The blonde said she didn't expect the roles of the emperor's favorite and the princess to change so quickly. She added that the princess managed to capture His Majesty's attention, which is why her true nature is so important. The princess smiled and commented that she was surprised, as she didn't imagine His Majesty would open up to her so much so soon. A lady-in-waiting commented that the emperor had finally recognized the inner beauty of Lady Stuart. Suddenly, someone asked Sharon if she had gotten sad. The princess supposed that perhaps those words seemed too harsh to her. She asked her not to take it so personally. One of the ladies summarized that it was a lamentable situation when you had nothing, and you desperately clung to someone who had already left. What was said seriously angered the protagonist. So, the girl understood that SD had been organized with the intention of mocking her. She understood that she had been wrong to trust Diana and agree to chat. The situation resembled that dinner. Suddenly, the butler appeared with a tray of sweets and happily declared that the aristocrats had accepted Sharon into their circle. He added that it was pleasant to see how the ladies exchanged kind words and that. Apparently, all of them felt sympathy for the girl, except Lady Eaton, of course. The princess grumbled discontentedly and asked since when the butler cared so much about Sharon. Catherine replied that on that strange dinner day, she understood something. The sun of the empire only shone in one place. Diana understood what the butler meant and was displeased with those words. Did the spectators realize what this phrase was hiding? The woman acknowledged that Sharon really got drunk. She went out to the garden for some fresh air, but returned very late. She recounted that the emperor was so worried about Mrs. Sharon that he searched for her all night to return her to the palace. For some reason, with a satisfied smile, Diana deduced that this is how it happened. Catherine sincerely wondered where Sharon had been and what she had done that night. But shortly before dawn, she met the emperor, disheveled and sleepless. She asked him where His Majesty had been all this time. Perhaps insomnia overcame him again. Catherine said Charn hadn't returned yet, but the lord replied that there was no need to look for her. The woman was shocked. The emperor begged that, when Charn returned, she should simply act as if nothing had happened. When the emperor passed, the housekeeper noticed straw falling on him and wondered if the lord had been in the stable all this time. Thinking of the stables, Catherine immediately thought of Charn. Princess Diana laughed and said she had worried in vain. But Catherine replied that it was not in vain. The kind and sensitive heart of the girl from the island cannot be guilty. Mrs. Stuart was indignant. She didn't expect it to end like this. The princess's friends were also shocked by the housekeeper's words. One of them concluded that in that case, Diana was terribly humiliated. With false regret, Mrs. Stewart said that Sharn should not be involved in this. And she thanked Catherine profusely for telling her. Suddenly, she said she remembered that she urgently had to visit her father to tell him the story after arriving. The princess's friends affirmed that they would do the same and thanked Sharn for the good time they spent. When only Sharn remained at the table, Catherine commented that she had worked so hard to prepare this dessert. But now it would spoil without being enjoyed. She was indignant at the thought that the ladies could have tried at least a piece before leaving. Charm wondered if the head butler's story about His Majesty's actions that night was true. Catherine said that the girl herself knew everything, since His Majesty could not sleep peacefully without her. Suddenly, the protagonist understood why the Emperor looked so unwell that day, and why he suddenly became so cold. It was obvious that he was simply exhausted because he spent the whole night looking for his personal servant. It turns out that what Charm saw that night was not just a product of her imagination. She understood that she had disappointed His Majesty again. The protagonist tried to figure out how she could correct that mistake. Suddenly, a white cat named Alberta came running into the pavilion where Sharn was. And Catherine. No one had yet noticed that her collar was stained with blood. The head housekeeper was surprised to see the cat there, especially since it wore a small bell, which meant it had an owner. Sharon was mentally annoyed, wondering what kind of creature they called the cat, since it looked more like a mix of cat and dog. Catherine insisted that they must find its owner as soon as possible and tried to touch it. But at that moment, the animal showed its sharp claws and scratched the lady's hand. Sharon immediately ran to the head housekeeper to make sure everything was fine. Catherine replied that she screamed in surprise, but that in reality it was nothing serious. At that moment, Sharon heard the princess call the animal by its name. Diana firmly named it again, Navi, and said she had finally found it. She commented that it was time to teach the cat a lesson, since it was not appropriate to scratch people for no reason. Sharon reflected on the fact that she thought she had heard that name before. So Navi was the one Lady Eaton had warned them to be careful of. Colin ran in and convinced Mom to put on a bandage, and Catherine assured that it was just a cat scratch. But even after the doctor's visit, the head housekeeper's condition did not improve. She often cried out in pain. Sometimes the wound hurt and burned. Sharon affirmed that black poison was coming out of the cut. An ordinary person would not see it without knowledge of magic, but for her, it was as clear as day. The protagonist decided that she had been right to think that the animal was the culprit. It seemed that the Chancellor kept not a cat, but a beast. She said there was poison in its claws. That's why the head housekeeper was suffering. Colin and Catherine looked at Catherine with surprise. Sharon said that human medicines would not work. And since this beast was created with the Chancellor's magic, the problem is even more serious. She added that there was only one way. They had to kill Navi. Only then would the poison and the spell be destroyed. Naturally, Colin didn't like the idea, but it was the only way to save the housekeeper. Catherine protested about the unpredictability of life, but under no circumstances should the king be informed. Sharn took Sir Colin and began to whisper something in his ear. Then she approached the Emperor. As soon as he set foot on the threshold, Julian noticed that Sharn was touching his assistant. Instead of explaining the situation, Sharn ran out of the tent, shouting apologies, saying that they had to hurry. The Emperor looked at them with disdain. Sharon commented that she almost had a heart attack when she unexpectedly encountered the king while coming here. Then she looked at Colin and asked what was wrong with his face. He replied that everything was fine. He inquired why she wanted to speak alone. She asked him if he could lend her a knife. She added that she thought she had to solve it herself, without external intervention. He opened his eyes and asked if she intended to kill Navi with her own hands. She interrupted him and confirmed that it was so. She concluded that she wanted to kill Navi personally, and explained that if it is revealed now that the Chancellor's pet is a monster and attack the economics girl, everything will get out of control. The hunting tournament will turn into a battlefield. And this is the Chancellor's territory. All factors are against the king. Colin highly doubted this idea. He asked if Sharn was really sure she could do it alone. The girl agreed, but pointed out that she would need the boy's help to distract the Chancellor. Sharn said that if Colin creates a diversion, she will go after Navi and put an end to this before Catherine's wounds worsen. Sharn said that since she is participating in the hunting tournament, she should test her strength. As a child, she used to wave sticks in the yard. The hunt began, and everyone headed into the forest. Diana finally caught up with His Highness and exclaimed happily, "Here he is." She wanted to see the Emperor before the hunt started. She was interested to know if her family's land meets the Emperor's standards. Although the Chancellor's property is already famous, isn't it? Meanwhile, Julian barely heard the princess and didn't stop looking at Colin. And Sharn, who in his opinion were too close. He wondered what they were saying. Even as Julian galloped across the rivers on horseback, he did not turn around. His gaze was fixed ahead. But at some point, his feelings spread like a spiderweb, forcing him to unconsciously follow Sharn. And Colin. Meanwhile, Albert was rushing to prepare for the start of the hunt. He asked his favorite dogs, wouldn't they miss the taste of blood? He promised them that they would be entertained soon. And finally, the shot was heard. Startled by the shot, the birds let out a cry. The dogs barked and started running. Sharn and Colin watched curiously as the Chancellor rushed after the dogs. Even with only peripheral vision, Albert managed to see Sharn's figure hidden behind a tree. The Chancellor ironically pointed out that someone was following him and announced that it was time for Navi to hunt. He ordered it to kill without restraint. Colin called Sharn worriedly, saying that Navi was approaching and she should be careful. She assured him she was ready and wished Sir Colin to be careful too. Sharn clenched her sword and mentally told the Chancellor that Navi would not return to its owner. And so Navi appeared. Sharn expected to suddenly step out and yell at it to stop. But an absurd pull ruined everything. As she moved to untangle herself, her eyes fixed on a luxurious building. It was strange that such a beautiful house was so deep in the forest. Did this luxury belong to the Chancellor? Sharn wondered if this was the same small palace she had heard about during tea before the hunt. They said Albert's luxurious estate was somewhere in that forest. That's why Navi found her without problems. The young woman deduced that this could make things easier, since if they managed to push the cat inside, it would be easier to eliminate it. The garden is well kept, but there is no one inside. It was cold and frightening in the mansion, perhaps due to being surrounded by a dense forest. Sharon wondered where that creature had hidden. She tried to understand what terrible monster Navi was. If it was created with sorcery, destroying it wouldn't be easy. Suddenly, the girl heard the light ringing of Navi's collar bell. Was the bloodthirsty beast behind her? It happened in the blink of an eye. Navi's claws not only scratched Sharon, but also tore her flesh. The young woman moaned from the severe pain of the neck wound. But at that moment, Navi was preparing to attack again. Then, the protagonist urged herself to remain calm to get rid of this creature. The author maintains the intrigue and shifts the spectators to the forest, where the Emperor fires a shot. The shot turned out to be accurate. Julian felled the deer. The crowd of aristocrats surrounded the Emperor and commented that he was still magnificent. Some even said they wanted to learn from him. Albert watched the scene with disapproval. His secretary said it would be awkward if the princess were here, because then they would have to choose between the future fiancé and a loving father. Albert scornfully affirmed that the young emperor had felt like a fish in water. Then he asked with a smile, could this last forever? He was happy, as he had carefully raised and tamed his cat. One touch from the claws or teeth of this beast, and the emperor's beloved woman would die. The chancellor wondered how the emperor would react upon discovering his cold body. And lifeless. The hunting competitions were over. Charn should have returned, and Collins was beginning to get uneasy. A terrifying thought invaded him. Were they hunting her herself, or had something happened? The lord crept closer and asked why the assistant looked so absorbed. Collins jumped and commented that the emperor had scared him. But he was intrigued as to why the boy looked so serious from the very beginning of the tournament. The boy asked if everything was that bad, and replied that he would clarify later. The Lord remembered that he had the exact same expression when he found out that his first beloved had fallen in love with the neighboring prince. He grabbed him by the neck and growled that if the wretch didn't want to die, he would speak immediately. Then, the emperor's assistant confessed that Sharn had gone to hunt Navi. Julian asked again, thinking he misheard. But Collins repeated what was said, and added that now it was extremely dangerous, leaving the emperor perplexed. Then, the boy summarized everything, adding at the end that if they didn't kill the cat, his mother would be in danger. Collins revealed the plan. While he served as a diversion, Sharn chased the creature. Julian was furious and indignant that the assistant hadn't informed him. Collins recalled that His Majesty had to concentrate on Princess Diana. Besides, the boy didn't want to cause trouble in the Chancellor's territory while his mother was there. He affirmed that he was ready to take responsibility and do anything to get her back, since she could have been poisoned with the beast's venom. The emperor replied that the boy didn't have to do it. He added that he saw no reason to try harder. Words that were as sharp as a sword blade. Finally, the revelation suddenly reached Giuliano. His emotions overcame cold logic. They couldn't just ignore it. The more he tried, the fewer results he got. Every effort was in vain. He affirmed that Sharn was his, so he would go look for her. Meanwhile, the protagonist fought with all her might against a bloodthirsty beast. Sharn paused for an instant upon seeing the trail of purple blood on the knife blade. It meant only one thing. Horrified, she realized that in front of her was a real furry monster. Her thoughts pierced her like a sword. If she hesitated now, it would be a fatal mistake. Mentally, the protagonist addressed Nami and asked her to remember her face, since that would be her last memory. Sharn ran and brandished the knife. The cat barely escaped at the last second. The girl asked what ran so fast and laughed. Her laughter sounded unusually loud in the empty palace. The monster writhed like an eel, dodging the knife. Suddenly, the unpredictable animal lunged at the heroine and bit her. Probably, the spectators can imagine the insults Charney dedicated to the animal. Her heart pounded wildly. The protagonist couldn't afford any more mistakes. She decided that the next strike must be accurate. Charney swallowed, gripping the knife tighter. When the cat tried to lunge at Charney again, the young woman concentrated to the maximum. The knife plunged exactly into the mark, splashing blood on the floor. Exhausted, Charney fell to the floor, barely catching her breath and looking around. She whispered, "Where is that damn thing?" Her hand tightened around the hilt of the sword. The young woman felt it inside her. The enemy would appear right now, when their strength had almost vanished. Weakness and trembling took over her muscles. Her legs couldn't hold, and the young woman fell. The world blurred before her eyes, but losing consciousness now meant signing her death warrant. Sharn convinced herself to hold on and not faint when she heard footsteps behind the door. The doors flew wide open. Sharn saw the emperor standing before her. He immediately leaned over her. He gently pronounced her name and said he knew everything. Julian was interested if she had managed to find and eliminate Albert's cat, but Sharn remained silent. So he tried to ask again. But instead of an answer, he let out an emotional cry. From the beginning, Julian was sure that Sharn would be where he was heading. Something impossible to explain with logic. But he felt invisible threads connecting him to Sharn, so he moved forward following his instinct. The Emperor's mind clouded with worry, haunted by horrible visions. He was furious to see her always taking on the most dangerous things. And yet, upon seeing her savior, Sharn only managed to exclaim that there was a monster. She clarified that it wasn't an abandoned dog or a stray animal. According to her, it was a mutant creature, something unnatural created through sorcery. Julian admitted he had already heard it from Colin, but wondered why the young woman hadn't told him. He was indignant. Had Sharn gone crazy by facing that danger alone? He asked what Sharn would have done if she died before he arrived, and why she always took on everything alone. The young woman replied that she didn't want to worry His Majesty. Besides, it was the Chancellor's territory. She added that the only important thing now was that this monster stopped breathing. The protagonist explained that she had wounded the creature several times. It must be hiding somewhere in the mansion. Sharn said it was necessary to confirm that it was dead. The emperor replied that he understood. He said in a careful tone that the girl had done enough. Now she needed to rest. Julian whispered that he would take care of the rest. Suddenly, before the young woman's eyes, Pachan appeared, disappearing into the water. She shouted for the boy to hold on tight, but immediately everything disappeared. The protagonist wondered if it had all been just a dream. The girl felt a strong heat. She turned around and realized that everything was burning. His Majesty was in the center of the flames. She thanked him for being able to rest. The emperor did not react. Afterward, she finally managed to make him hear her voice and ask if the emperor was all right. The protagonist asked what to do if the mansion was destroyed. How to explain it to the chancellor. Julian replied that he didn't care, even if Albert insisted on investigating the incident. He complained of feeling unwell. He noticed flaws in his heartbeat rhythm. Sharon enthusiastically asked for clarification about what ailment he had. Could it be arrhythmia? The emperor clarified that his heart no longer obeyed him, and the next instant he pressed his lips to the protagonist's. But the girl shouted indignantly and pushed his Majesty away from her. What are you plotting? Then Julian affirmed, having made a decision. Charn asked the emperor not to say anything. She was surprised that it wasn't so, and she replied by asking how she could accept that his Majesty professed feelings for her. The Emperor of Valdek fell in love with the servant from Sursum. Although next to him is a noble lady, much more worthy of being empress, Sharna understood that she only had a contract and a defined role with the emperor, nothing more. She had to remember her place. Julian told her she couldn't run away anymore. Everything was decided. Not even he could reverse it. He explained that he tried to escape, frightened by these feelings, but his desires intertwined like threads in a knot. The young man announced to her that he could no longer resist. He had to admit that he yearned not only for the throne, but also for Sharon. She dominated him as much as the desire for power did. Now even his hardened heart burns. All the aristocrats, including Julian and Albert, gathered at the Chancellor's palace. The emperor said he understood that the Chancellor was very affected by the fire in his mansion. But it was inevitable. Albert smiled sarcastically and asked a rhetorical question. Could nothing really be done? He went on to say that in his whole life, he had seen something so inevitable. His Majesty affirmed that if from the beginning the Chancellor's cat had not been a monster, none of this would have happened. He explained that the animal attacked his personal servant and the head housekeeper. And to destroy it, they had to set the property on fire. The emperor recalled that the Chancellor knew that if a monster poisoned someone, the correct solution was to destroy it. The aristocrats whispered that burning the Chancellor's palace was excessive. But it was correct if the cat was truly a monster. Many were interested to know if Mrs. Stewart knew about it. The Chancellor said that if His Majesty envied the palace so much, he would gladly have given it to him. It's a pity it ended like this. Julian pointed out that it was very generous of the Chancellor, but he has his own palace, the Imperial one. He added ironically that his palace was much cozier than that ostentatious cottage, built with the people's taxes. Julian asked if it wasn't absurd from the start that the emperor depended on a vassal. In his opinion, it was ridiculous and could not continue like this.